There is a moment in the life of every sailor when the sea stops being a place of work and becomes something else entirely, when the horizon, that fixed and reassuring line between sky and water, begins to fill with shapes that should not be there, shapes too large, too angular, too deliberate to be anything other than what the mind refuses at first to accept. On the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, that moment arrived for the men of Task Unit 77.4.3 at roughly 6:30 in the morning. They were eating breakfast. They were running flight operations. They were doing what sailors do on an ordinary morning in a war that had been going on long enough to have its own rhythms and routines. And then the shells began to fall. Not just any shells. Shells fired from guns so large that the rounds they threw weighed more than a full-grown automobile. Shells from battleships, from the largest battleship ever built by human hands. Shells that hit the water around the small, slow American escort carriers and threw up columns of purple and red and yellow spray, dye markers used by the Japanese to track their own salvos, so that the ocean around Taffy 3 suddenly looked like something from a fever dream, a sea painted in impossible colors while death came screaming in from the horizon at better than 500 meters per second. The men aboard those ships had not expected this. No one had expected this. They were not supposed to be here in this fight against this enemy. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 had been built from merchant hulls. They were slow. They were lightly armed. They carried a single 5-inch gun each. They were designed to hunt submarines and support ground troops from the air, not to survive a surface engagement with a fleet that included 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. Against that armada, Taffy 3's entire force, 6 carriers, 7 escorts, was so outgunned as to make the comparison almost absurd. And yet, what happened next would become one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of naval warfare. What happened next would be studied in war colleges, debated by historians, and commemorated in the memories of the men who lived through it and the families of those who did not. What happened next was not a defeat. Against every rational calculation, against every measure of firepower and tonnage and military logic, it was something much closer to the opposite. This is the story of the Battle of Samar. It is a story about the gap between what should happen and what actually does. It is a story about small ships doing impossible things, about destroyer captains ordering charges into battle lines that dwarfed their vessels the way a schoolyard fence dwarfs a cathedral, about pilots making attack runs with no ammunition because even an empty aircraft diving at a battleship forces the gunners to flinch. And every second those gunners flinch is a second the men in the water behind them might survive. About an admiral sending desperate radio calls into the silence, left behind by the most powerful naval covering force in the world, a force that had simply left, drawn north by a Japanese deception so elegant and so costly that it nearly decided the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign in a single morning. It is also, underneath all of that, a very human story about young men, most of them very young, crewing ships that were by any measure the bottom tier of the American fleet's fighting strength, who found themselves asked to do something that military doctrine had never actually anticipated. The plan had not accounted for this. There was no protocol for this. There was only the moment, and the men in it, and the decision that had to be made in the space of a few seconds with the sea turning purple and red around them. Some of them would not come home. The ships that went down at Samar left hundreds of men in the water, and the water held them for days, days of sharks and thirst and the particular horror of not knowing whether anyone was coming to find them. The battle itself lasted a few brutal hours. The ordeal that followed for the survivors stretched across what must have felt, in the open ocean, like a different kind of eternity. But before any of that, before the smoke screens and the torpedo runs and the final plunge of the Samuel B. Roberts and the burning of the St. Lo, there is a larger picture to understand. Because the Battle of Samar did not happen in isolation. It happened at the fulcrum point of the entire Pacific War, at the moment when Imperial Japan was attempting one last, vast, almost operatically desperate act of naval aggression to stop the American advance toward the Philippine Islands and, beyond them, toward Japan itself. The operation they devised, a multi-pronged convergence of nearly every major surface warship they had left, was breathtaking in its ambition and heartbreaking in the almost fatalistic honesty with which its architects discussed its chances. They knew what it was, they did it anyway, and what stood in their way, at the critical moment, was not the immense power of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, which had gone north chasing shadows. What stood in their way was Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 7 tin cans, and the particular fierce, ungovernable human refusal to simply accept the mathematics of the situation and give way. If you are here for the long form, for the full account, from the strategic planning rooms of Imperial Japan to the wreckage-strewn waters of the Philippine Sea, then settle in, turn down the lights. Let the story breathe over the course of what follows. We will walk through every phase of this battle and the events that shaped it to the deception that pulled Halsey's fleet north, the overnight passage of Admiral Kurita's armada through the San Bernardino Strait, the chaos of the opening salvos, the charges of the tin cans, the argument and silences and miscommunications at the highest levels of American command, and finally, the long reckoning with what the battle cost and what it ultimately preserved. This channel exists to bring these stories to you in full, not as summaries, not as highlights, but as the complete, considered, human account that the men who lived them deserve. If you find value in that kind of storytelling, the best thing you can do is subscribe, so that the next story finds its way to you the same way this one has quietly, in the dark, at whatever hour the world finally gets still enough to listen, because history, at its best, is not a list of dates and outcomes. It is the sound of a ship's bell at 6:30 on an ordinary morning, and the look on a sailor's face when he realizes that the shapes on the horizon are real, and that he is going to have to do something about them. That morning is where we begin. The Pacific Ocean is the largest body of water on Earth, spread across nearly 180 million square kilometers. It holds more than half of all the open water our planet possesses. In the autumn of 1944, much of that ocean was at war. Not the distant, abstracted kind of war that exists in newspapers and radio broadcasts, but war in its most physical and merciless form. Steel ships burning on dark water, aircraft spinning out of tropical skies, men dying far from any shore that mattered to them. For 3 years and more, 2 nations had been tearing at each other across this immensity, and by October of that year the long shape of the conflict had become clear to almost everyone who understood it. Japan was losing. The question that remained was how much blood and ocean it would take to finish the thing. The road to 1944 had been a brutal education for both sides. Japan had opened the war with a stunning sweep across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and a chain of island fortresses stretching from the central Pacific to the borders of India. For a brief window, the empire controlled more territory than any Asian power in history. But the United States, once fully mobilized, brought industrial capacity to bear that no strategist in Tokyo had ever honestly reckoned with. New carriers rolled out of American shipyards faster than Japan could sink the old ones. New aircraft replaced losses faster than Japanese factories could match them. New crews trained in vast numbers while Japan's pool of experienced aviators slowly bled away in battle after battle. The tide had not turned in a single moment. It had turned the way a great river turns gradually, inexorably, with enormous weight behind it. By late 1944, American forces had executed a strategy that the war's planners called island hopping, a methodical advance across the Central and South Pacific, seizing key islands, bypassing heavily garrisoned ones, and using each new position as a stepping stone toward Japan itself. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, each campaign had cost lives and time, but each had pushed the perimeter of American air power closer to the Japanese home islands. The fall of Saipan in the summer of 1944 had been particularly devastating for Japan, placing the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers within striking range of Tokyo. The loss had been so severe that it brought down the government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a seismic political event that revealed just how deeply the war's reversal had shaken the Japanese state from its foundations. It was into this contracting world that General Douglas MacArthur had fixed his gaze on the Philippines. For MacArthur, the islands were not simply a strategic objective, they were a personal promise. He had commanded American and Filipino forces there at the war's beginning. He had been ordered out by President Roosevelt in the desperate early months of 1942, evacuated by patrol torpedo boat and then aircraft as Japanese forces closed in. His parting words, "I shall return," had become one of the most repeated phrases of the entire war, a promise that carried the weight of both personal honor and American credibility. The Philippines had been in American territory for more than 4 decades. Tens of thousands of Filipino soldiers and civilians had died or been imprisoned under Japanese occupation. Returning to liberate them was, in MacArthur's mind, not a matter of strategic preference. It was a matter of obligation. The strategic arguments for retaking the Philippines, however, went well beyond MacArthur's personal reckoning. The archipelago sat at a geographic choke point of extraordinary importance. The sea lanes running north through the Philippines connected Japan to the resource-rich territories it had conquered in Southeast Asia, the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice paddies of Indochina. Without those resources, particularly without the oil, the Japanese military machine could not function. The Imperial Navy's warships could not steam. The Imperial Army's tanks and trucks could not move. Japanese aircraft would be grounded. Cutting or seriously threatening those supply lines by seizing the Philippines would not merely inconvenience Japan. It would begin to strangle the empire at the throat. American naval planners understood this leverage completely, and so did their Japanese counterparts. There had been serious debate within the American High Command about whether to invade the Philippines directly or to bypass them in favor of Taiwan, which offered some of the same geographic advantages. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had leaned toward Taiwan at various points. MacArthur had argued passionately and at length against any plan that would leave the Philippines unrecovered, citing both the strategic and moral dimensions of abandoning the Filipino people a second time. When the decision finally reached President Roosevelt, he sided with MacArthur. The Philippines would be the target. Leyte Gulf, in the central Visayas, would be the entry point. Leyte Gulf was chosen for its relative accessibility, the defensibility of its approaches, and the fact that Leyte Island's flat coastal plains offered space to build the airfields that the campaign would require. A successful landing at Leyte would establish a foothold in the Philippine heartland, from which American forces could drive north toward Luzon, the largest island and the seat of Japanese military power in the archipelago. The planned landing date was set for the 20th of October, 1944, a date that MacArthur himself marked with the kind of theatrical gravity he had spent a career cultivating. The operation would involve the largest naval armada yet assembled in the Pacific theater, a fleet of extraordinary size and complexity drawn from across the ocean. The American force that converged on Leyte Gulf in those October days was almost incomprehensible in its scale. Admiral William Halsey commanded the Third Fleet, which included the Fast Carrier Task Force, a striking arm of fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that represented the most powerful offensive naval formation in the world. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the Seventh Fleet, the force directly supporting MacArthur's landings, comprising older battleships, escort carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and the vast fleet of transport and supply ships that would carry an army to the beaches. Together, these two commands fielded hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of men. The combined force was the product of 3 years of furious American industrial effort, and it was pointed like a spear at the heart of the Philippine archipelago. Across the sea, Japan prepared its response. The Japanese High Command knew what an American lodgment in the Philippines would mean. They had been watching their strategic situation deteriorate for 2 years, and they understood with cold clarity that if the Philippines fell, the empire's southern resource lifeline would be severed. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies, which had to pass through Philippine waters, would become impossible to sustain under American air and sea interdiction. Without that oil, the Japanese fleet would eventually be reduced to an expensive collection of immobile steel. The army would lose its mobility. The war would be lost not in a final dramatic battle, but in a slow, grinding material exhaustion that offered no honor and no hope. Better, in the judgment of the Japanese High Command, to risk everything in one decisive engagement than to be worn down piecemeal. That judgment produced one of the most complex and ambitious naval plans of the entire war. The Japanese Navy began assembling forces from across their shrinking empire, from home waters, from Singapore, from their remaining island bases, concentrating strength for an operation they called Shogo, or Victory Operation. The plan called for multiple surface forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions simultaneously, overwhelming American defenses through sheer complexity and the threat of annihilation to the landing fleet. It was a plan born of desperation as much as strategic calculation, a recognition that Japan no longer had the resources to wage a war of attrition, and that only a sudden, shattering blow could reverse the tide. Whether the plan was brilliant or reckless depended entirely on things its architects could not fully control: timing, weather, communication, and the decisions of commanders far from any headquarters. The men on both sides of this gathering confrontation knew, in the way that soldiers and sailors always know before a major action, that something enormous was coming. American sailors aboard their ships in the days before the late landings went about their routines with the particular alertness of men who have learned to trust their instincts. They had fought their way across the Pacific, and they understood that the closer they came to Japan, the harder Japan would fight. On the Japanese side, officers who had read the intelligence reports and studied the charts knew that what they were preparing to attempt was extraordinarily dangerous, perhaps even suicidal in its ambition. Some of them wrote letters home that sounded more like farewells than correspondence. The ocean they were all sailing toward was about to become something else, not a highway of trade or a theater of maneuver, but a killing ground for one of the most remarkable and terrible naval engagements ever fought. The stage was set across hundreds of kilometers of Philippine Sea and strait, from the deep water of the Philippine Sea to the shallow, shelter reaches of Leyte Gulf itself. Armies were moving, fleets were steaming, aircraft were armed and fueled, and spotted on flight decks in the warm October air. And somewhere in the complex machinery of history, a sequence of decisions was already in motion. Decisions made in Washington and Tokyo, in fleet headquarters and on bridge wings, that would bring a handful of small American ships to a confrontation that no textbook of naval warfare had ever anticipated or prepared them for. The ocean lay vast and indifferent around all of it, as it always has, keeping its own counsel, waiting to receive whatever the men above its surface were about to do to one another. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's strategic position had contracted to something close to desperation. The vast perimeter of island bases and ocean territory seized in the opening years of the war had been steadily eaten away. Guadalcanal, the Marshalls, the Marianas, each lost, tightening the noose around the home islands and severing another arterial route through which oil, rubber, and raw materials had once flowed north from the conquered territories of Southeast Asia. The fall of Saipan in the summer of that year had brought American bombers within range of the Japanese mainland for the first time, and the naval defeats at the Philippine Sea had gutted the carrier air groups that were supposed to be Japan's long arm of power. What remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy was still formidable on paper, a collection of battleships and cruisers of genuine fighting power, but its fuel reserves were critically low, its experienced aviators largely gone, and its leadership burdened by the knowledge that the arithmetic of industrial production had turned decisively and irreversibly against them. Against this backdrop, the prospect of an American landing in the Philippines was not merely a territorial setback, it was an existential threat. The Philippines sat astride the sea lanes connecting Japan to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Lose the Philippines, and those supply routes were cut. Lose those routes, and a fleet that remained would have nowhere to sail and nothing to burn. It was within this context of mounting crisis that the Japanese High Command began to formulate what they called Shogo, the victory operation. The word itself carried a certain bleak irony. Those who devised it understood, at some level, that outright victory in the conventional sense was probably beyond reach. What they were really designing was a catastrophic counterstroke, an operation so violent and so decisive that it might shatter American momentum in the Pacific long enough to force a negotiated settlement rather than the unconditional surrender that now loomed as the most likely alternative. Shogo was not one plan but a family of contingency plans, each triggered depending on where the Americans chose to strike next. When American forces began their approach to the Philippines in October of that year, it was Shogo that was activated, the variant designed specifically for a battle in Philippine waters, and the most ambitious and intricate of them all. The operational logic of Shogo 1 was bold, even elegant. In its conception, it rested on a fundamental problem. American naval strength was now so great that no single Japanese force could hope to meet it head-on and win. The answer the planners devised was not to concentrate strength but to divide American attention, to strike from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a situation of such complexity and confusion that the Americans would be unable to cover every threat at once. 3 separate surface forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different approaches, squeezing the invasion fleet from multiple directions at the same moment. The largest and most powerful of these, a massive concentration of battleships and heavy cruisers, would transit the Philippine archipelago by the most direct but most dangerous route, passing through the narrow inland waters before breaking out into the Philippine Sea to fall upon the landing beaches from the north. A second, smaller surface force would approach from the south, through the Surigao Strait, catching the invasion fleet in a pincer. Together, they were intended to reach the beachhead simultaneously, trapping the American transports and landing ships between 2 walls of gunfire. But the planners knew that such a movement could not succeed if the powerful American covering fleet, Admiral House's Third Fleet, with its fast carriers and battleships, was present to intercept it. And so Shogo 1 incorporated a 4th element, the most coldly calculated piece in the entire design. Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, stripped of most of their aircraft and most of their trained air crews after the disasters of the previous year, would be sent south as bait. They would present themselves to Halsey as a tempting target, a prize that his aggressive instincts would compel him to chase. If the decoy worked, the Third Fleet would be drawn far to the north and away from the landing beaches, leaving the surface forces free to do their work unopposed. The men who sailed aboard those carriers understood their role with terrible clarity. They were not expected to win a fight. They were expected to draw one and to survive if they could, as a secondary consideration to the needs of the larger operation. The officer selected to command the most powerful of the 3 surface groups, the great armada that would transit through the heart of the Philippines and strike the beachhead from the north, was Vice Admiral Kurita. He was a career naval officer of considerable experience and demonstrated competence, a man who had commanded surface forces throughout the Pacific War and who understood the lethal geometry of fleet engagements as well as anyone in the Imperial Navy. He was also a man who had recently survived the sinking of his own flagship by an American submarine during an earlier transit, an experience that left him shaken in ways that would not become apparent until the critical moment of the coming battle. Kurita accepted his assignment with the formal composure expected of a senior officer of the Imperial Navy, but those close to him understood that he harbored serious doubts about the operation's viability. He was not a man given to theatrical declarations, but his questions to the planning staff, precise, technical, quietly insistent, suggested a mind probing for weaknesses in a plan it did not entirely trust. The officer assigned to lead the Southern Surface Force that would push through the Surigao Strait was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, a blunt and determined commander whose force was significantly smaller and whose prospects of success were correspondingly limited. Nishimura received his orders, asked few questions, and prepared to carry them out with a directness that bordered on fatalism. A second, loosely coordinated Southern force under Vice Admiral Kiyohachima would follow behind him through the same strait, though the two men's forces were never formally integrated under a single command, a gap in coordination that would prove catastrophic when the moment came. The carrier decoy force, the sacrificial arm of the operation, fell under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. Of all the commanders involved in Shogo 1, Ozawa perhaps understood his role most clearly and accepted it most completely. His carriers were the bait, and he intended to dangle them as conspicuously as possible. The mood that surrounded the planning and preparation for Shogo 1 was unlike anything that had attended earlier Japanese naval operations. In the early years of the war, the Imperial Navy had gone to battle with genuine confidence in its training, its equipment, and its fighting spirit. By October of 1944, that confidence had been replaced by something harder and stranger, a kind of resolute acceptance. Senior officers spoke openly in planning sessions about the possibility, even the likelihood, that the operation would not succeed in a military sense, but that it must be attempted regardless, because the alternative was to allow the Philippines to fall without a fight and thus concede the final strategic defeat, without ever testing whether the fleet still had enough left in it to matter. Some framed this in the language of honor and obligation. Others were more pragmatic, arguing that even a failed offensive might buy time, might impose costs on the Americans, might change the calculus of the war in ways that could not yet be foreseen. But beneath both framings lay the same uncomfortable truth that Shogo 1 was a gamble made by men who knew the odds were against them and who had decided to play anyway. The fuel situation alone spoke to the desperation of the moment. Moving the combined fleet from its dispersed anchorages to the assembly points for Shogo 1 would consume reserves that could not easily be replaced. Some of the battleships scheduled to participate in the operation were fueled in part with unrefined crude oil drawn directly from captured wells in Borneo, a measure that risked fouling boiler systems but reflected a supply crisis that had moved well beyond the point of conventional solutions. The men who crewed these ships knew something of the constraints under which they operated. They were not kept entirely in the dark. And yet the tone recorded in letters and diaries from that period does not despair so much as a compressed, almost formal determination, a sense that what was about to happen was both necessary and probably final, and that it should be met with the bearing appropriate to the occasion. When the orders were issued and the fleet began to move, it did so with a kind of terrible, slow grandeur. Curator's force, the great northern arm of the operation, assembled in Brunei Bay before setting out across the South China Sea toward the Philippine archipelago. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary concentration of naval power, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers moving information across the sea that Japanese aircraft could no longer reliably protect. The passage would take them through waters where American submarines were active and American aircraft operated freely in the hours around dawn and dusk. The planners had accepted these risks. They had built them into the plan as losses to be absorbed rather than dangers to be avoided. The operation could not wait for conditions to improve, because conditions were not going to improve. Every week that passed strengthened the American position. Every ship that set at anchor burned fuel it could not easily replace. Shogo 1 had to be launched now, with the forces available, under the conditions that existed, not the conditions that might have existed in a more favorable world. And so, in the first days of the final week of October in 1944, the machinery of the operation began to turn. Kurita's Samar steered northeast through the South China Sea. Nishimura's smaller force plotted its course toward the southern straits. Ozawa's hollow carriers turned south, straining to be seen, broadcasting radio signals and hoping the Americans were listening. Across the Philippine Sea, on the decks of escort carriers performing morning flight operations and in the dining halls where young American sailors ate breakfast and assumed the day would be ordinary, none of this was yet visible. The sea lay calm. The horizon was empty. The machinery that was coming toward them moved in darkness, and the distance between safety and catastrophe was closing with every passing hour. In the pre-dawn hours of the 25th of October, 1944, one of the most consequential decisions in American naval history was about to be made. The man who would make it was Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr., a figure whose name had become synonymous with American fighting spirit in the Pacific. Halsey commanded the United States Third Fleet, a force so vast and so powerful that it represented something unprecedented in human conflict, a concentration of firepower and naval capability that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same form. His fleet included 6 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers numbering in the dozens. The Third Fleet was the sword arm of the American Pacific Campaign, the instrument through which American naval superiority was projected across more than 1 million square miles of ocean. By October of 1944, this fleet had fought its way from the Gilbert Islands to the Marshall Islands to the approaches of the Philippines, and its record was one of almost unbroken tactical success. But success, particularly success achieved through aggression and initiative, carries within it the seeds of overconfidence. Halsey embodied that paradox more completely than perhaps any other commander in the Pacific War. Halsey was not a subtle man, and he had never aspired to be one. He was a career naval officer who had risen to prominence because of his aggressive instincts and his willingness to fight. His command style was built on the principle that the best defense was an offense pressed with overwhelming force and unwavering determination. He was famous throughout the Navy for his colorful language, his contempt for caution, and his conviction that hesitation was the enemy of victory. When he assumed command of the Third Fleet in August of 1944, he had issued a famous directive: kill chaps. The more we kill now, the fewer we will have to kill later. This was not the language of careful strategic planning or methodical operation. It was the language of a man who believed in hitting hard, hitting fast, and hitting with everything available. His officers and men admired him for this quality. In an era of global war where initiative and aggression were often rewarded, Halsey represented a pure expression of American naval combat doctrine. But command in war is not a matter of pure aggression alone. It requires the ability to distinguish between targets worthy of pursuit and the maintenance of primary objectives. This distinction would prove fatal to Halsey's judgment on the morning of the 25th of October. In the hours before dawn, as American forces were consolidating their position in Leyte Gulf and the transports were still unloading men and supplies, the radar operators aboard Halsey's flagship and the other ships of the Third Fleet began picking up contacts far to the north. These radar echoes represented a Japanese decoy carrier force, the bait in Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's brilliant and desperately gambled Shogo plan. This force, consisting of 4 carriers that had been stripped of their best pilots and were carrying only a fraction of their normal air complement, was approaching from the north. To Halsey, who had not been fully briefed on the possibility that this northern force might be a decoy, these contacts appeared to represent a significant opportunity. Here was a Japanese carrier force operating within striking distance of his own aircraft. The carriers were the capital ships of modern naval warfare, the instruments through which naval battles were fought at distances measured in tens of miles rather than hundreds of yards. Halsey had spent months stalking Japanese carriers. The prospect of destroying 4 of them, even if they were not fully operational, was a prize that transcended everything else in his strategic calculus. What Halsey did not fully appreciate was that his primary responsibility was not the pursuit of distant Japanese carriers but the protection of the beachhead at Leyte Gulf. The amphibious landing in Leyte had been the culmination of months of planning and preparation. It represented the beginning of the liberation of the Philippines and the return of General Douglas MacArthur to the islands from which he had been driven 4 years earlier. The landing was a massive undertaking involving hundreds of transports, dozens of troops still in the process of disembarking, and enormous quantities of supplies and equipment piled on the beaches. This invasion fleet was vulnerable, not to aerial attack. The air threat had been largely neutralized, but to surface attack by Japanese warships. This was precisely the scenario that the San Bernardino Strait, a narrow passage in the Philippine archipelago, was meant to guard against. Halsey had left a covering force in the strait, but this force was not designed to stop a major Japanese battle fleet. It was designed to detect and delay any Japanese surface force while Halsey's main battle line moved to intercept. The assumption underlying the entire plan was that Halsey would maintain station to cover the strait, or at least remain in a position where he could return quickly if needed. On the morning of the 25th of October, these careful assumptions began to unravel. The Japanese decoy carriers were being reported by Halsey's search aircraft. They were north, operating at sufficient distance that Halsey had perhaps a few hours before they would be within striking range of his fleet. More critically, from Halsey's perspective, they were operating at sufficient distance that if he moved now, if he took his entire Third Fleet north at maximum speed, he might accomplish something that every American admiral dreamed of: the annihilation of a Japanese carrier task force in open combat. The glory of such a victory, the headlines that would be generated, a place it would secure in the annals of naval history. All of this was visible to Halsey in the reports coming across his flag bridge. And so, in what would become one of the most scrutinized decisions of the entire Pacific campaign, Halsey made his choice. He ordered the Third Fleet to turn north. He ordered his carriers to be prepared for air strikes. He ordered his battleships and cruisers to form task groups ready for surface combat. And critically, he ordered no covering force to be left behind at the San Bernardino Strait. The entire fleet, every ship of tactical significance, was pointed north. The landing beaches at Leyte were now undefended against surface attack by major Japanese warships. This decision was not made in isolation or without consideration. Halsey believed, or at least told himself, that the reported Japanese force to the north was too significant to ignore. He believed that his responsibility was to seek out and destroy the enemy's naval forces wherever they could be found. This interpretation of his role had served him well in previous operations. His willingness to leave prepared defenses and set out in pursuit of the Japanese had resulted in victories that had contributed significantly to American progress toward Japan. But the difference between this operation and previous ones was that never before had Halsey been specifically directed to maintain station over an amphibious landing. The circumstances of Leyte Gulf were unique. An invasion fleet was ashore. Its transports were still vulnerable. The entire strategic plan for the Philippines campaign depended on establishing a secure lodgment in Leyte. And yet, confronted with the prospect of engaging Japanese carriers, Halsey turned away from this responsibility. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for the men of Taffy 3. The Japanese commander who had orchestrated this decoy had understood Halsey's psychology perfectly. Admiral Yamamoto, who had designed the original plan that came to be called Shogo, had been killed months earlier, but his successors had inherited his strategic vision. They understood that American commanders, when given the choice between protecting objectives and pursuing enemy forces, would often choose pursuit. They knew that Halsey in particular had a reputation for aggression and a hunger for combat, and so they had sent north this sacrificial force, 4 carriers with skeleton crews and minimal aircraft, knowing that the mere report of their presence would likely draw Halsey away from his covering position. It was an act of extraordinary strategic boldness. The Japanese were willing to lose an entire carrier task force as the price of creating an opportunity for their main battle fleet to reach the landing beaches. In the calculus of desperate warfare, it was a bet that made a kind of tragic sense. But for Halsey, the decision to go north was not conceived as abandoning his primary responsibility. He viewed it as an aggressive prosecution of the war. He believed that destroying enemy carriers was a legitimate and important objective. He apparently did not fully grasp that he was the only force standing between the San Bernardino Strait and the transports and landing craft at Leyte Gulf. As the morning progressed and the Third Fleet raced north, the first aircraft launched from Halsey's carriers. The weather was deteriorating in the direction of the Japanese decoy force, and the visibility was poor. The search aircraft reported that the carriers were there, confirmed by radar, but were the contacts actually where the pilots believed them to be? Confusion and uncertainty characterized the aerial search operations. Aircraft were launched, the weather thickened, and pilots struggled to maintain contact with the elusive quarry. Some aircraft returned without having seen anything. Others reported sightings that could not be verified. The reports that came back to Halsey's flag bridge suggested a force that was there, definitely there, somewhere to the north, but which seemed to have an uncanny ability to evade the American search pattern. What Halsey did not know was that the Japanese were deliberately maneuvering to keep him pointed in the wrong direction. They were using their decoy carriers to hold his attention while, at that very moment, the mightiest battle fleet assembled by Japan since the war began was passing through the San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, was now between the Third Fleet and Leyte Gulf. The shield that should have protected the landing beaches had been removed, and the most powerful Japanese surface force of the entire war was moving toward the vulnerable invasion fleet. The critical hours of the morning slipped away as Halsey pressed north. His subordinate commanders, some of them with more extensive knowledge of the overall operational plan, began to question the decision. What were they to do if the Japanese actually achieved a breakthrough at Leyte Gulf? How long could they sustain an operation in the north while the main landing might be in jeopardy? But Halsey, once committed to a course of action, did not second-guess himself. He was convinced that he was pursuing the right strategy. He believed that the destruction of the Japanese carriers would have a greater impact on the overall campaign than the protection of a landing zone that he felt was already sufficiently established to defend itself. This confidence, born of previous successes and of a genuine faith in the aggressiveness of the American Navy, was not entirely misplaced, but it was placed in a context that Halsey did not fully understand or appreciate. The Japanese decoy force was succeeding beyond the dreams of its commanders. It was drawing the main American naval force away from the area where it was most needed, and in the Philippine Sea, in the waters off Samar, the consequences of that strategic miscalculation were about to become apparent. By late morning, reports were beginning to come in from the south, from the sailors of the 7th Fleet and the observers with the escort carrier task units off Samar. There were contacts being reported, large contacts that seemed to be moving toward the landing beaches. But these reports, in their initial form, were unclear and somewhat garbled. The chain of command in the 7th Fleet was itself uncertain about the nature and composition of the force that was being reported. Some believed it might be a Japanese cruiser force. Others were not sure. The information flowed slowly through the communications channels, and by the time the full picture began to emerge, the Japanese center force was already engaging the first American units that lay in its path. But by then, Halsey was committed to his course north. He was already in pursuit of the Japanese decoy force, and the escorts and support ships that should have been defending the strait were with him or beyond his reach. The story of what happened next, the story of how a handful of escort carriers and destroyers, all that stood between Kurita's mighty fleet and the landing beaches, would fight an engagement that defied every principle of naval combat, belongs to the men and ships that Halsey had left behind. But the decision that set that story in motion was made by Halsey on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944. It was a decision born of aggressiveness, of a hunger for victory, and of a willingness to take great risks. It was also a decision that, in its own way, constituted a kind of test. The aggressiveness that Halsey had always seen as a virtue was about to be matched against the aggressiveness of others. The inferior force that he had left behind was about to discover depths of courage and resourcefulness that would make their own place in history. And Halsey, For all his faults and miscalculations, would never forget the morning when he turned north and left behind the most important objective of the entire campaign. When House's great fleet turned north and disappeared beyond the horizon, chasing the ghost of a carrier force it would take hours to reach, something was left behind. Not by accident, not through oversight, but by the cold arithmetic of a plan that assumed the Japanese center force had already been broken, that the San Bernardino Strait was effectively closed, and that the waters north of Leyte Gulf required nothing more than routine surveillance. What remained on station in those waters was a collection of small ships, unglamorous, unheroic in name, built for modest work in a vast and complicated war. They had no reason to expect what was coming. They had every reason to believe the morning of the 25th of October, 1944 would look very much like the mornings that had come before it. Task Unit 77.4.3. The designation itself carries a kind of bureaucratic anonymity, the sort of alphanumeric label that naval operations plans generate by the hundreds. But the men who served in it knew it by a simpler name, Taffy 3. It was one of 3 nearly identical escort carrier groups operating in the waters around Leyte Gulf, ranged north to south and tasked with providing air cover to the amphibious landing operation below. Taffy 1 held the southernmost station. Taffy 2 sat in the middle, and Taffy 3 patrolled the northernmost position, closest to the San Bernardino Strait, closest to the open Philippine Sea, closest, though no one yet understood this, to the approaching storm. On any naval chart of those hours, Taffy 3 occupied a rectangle of ocean that looked, to outside eyes, like a position of secondary importance. It was about to become the most important patch of water in the Pacific. The man responsible for Taffy 3 was Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague, a name not widely known outside naval circles, either before the battle or for many years after it. He was a naval aviator by training and by temperament, a career officer who had spent the better part of 2 decades working through the patient machinery of Navy advancement. He was not a headline figure. He had not commanded a famous ship or won a famous engagement. He was 51 years old, compact and plain-spoken, the kind of officer whose manner suggested reliability over flamboyance. His subordinates found him approachable, clear in his expectations, and calm under the ordinary pressures of fleet operations. No one had yet tested how he would hold under extraordinary ones. In the coming hours, that question would receive an answer none of them had anticipated. Sprague's command consisted of 13 ships. 6 of them were escort carriers, officially classified as CVEs, a designation that the men who sailed them translated with characteristic Navy humor as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. These were not the fleet carriers of Task Force 38, the great armored vessels whose names filled newspaper columns back home. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were smaller, slower, and structurally fragile by comparison, converted from merchant or tanker hulls, built in the urgency of wartime production with the goal of producing capable hulls quickly and in quantity rather than producing capital ships. They were roughly 150 meters in length, displacing somewhere between 7 and 8 tons when loaded. Their flight decks were wooden. Their boilers could push them to a maximum speed of roughly 18 knots on a good day with following seas, a pace that a determined cruiser could exceed without effort. Each carried a single 5-inch gun mounted aft, more useful for deterring submarines than for engaging warships. They were, in the truest sense, support vessels, built to carry aircraft and to put those aircraft into the air over friendly convoys and beachheads, not to fight their way out of an ambush. The 6 carriers of Taffy 3 were of Fanchar Bay, the St. Lo, the White Plains, the Callanan Bay, the Kitcon Bay, and the Gambier Bay. Each carried a composite air squadron of perhaps 24 aircraft, a mixture of torpedo bombers and fighter aircraft whose primary purpose was anti-submarine patrol, ground support, and fleet coordination. Their pilots were competent and practiced in those roles. The idea of those same aircraft engaging in combat against the surface battle fleet equipped with anti-aircraft guns on a scale the pilots had never encountered was a scenario nobody's training had addressed. Within hours, That would be exactly what was required of them. The aircraft they launched that morning were armed for submarine patrol or ground attack. Some would go up carrying nothing at all. They would fight anyway. The 7 smaller warships of Taffy 3 were divided between destroyers and destroyer escorts. The 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Hull, and the Human, were fleet destroyers, designed for surface combat as part of their intended role, though even they were built to screen fleet carriers and launch torpedo attacks against cruisers and destroyers, not to charge at battleships. They displaced roughly 2,000 tons each, carried 5-inch guns and twin mounts, and were armed with torpedoes. Fast and maneuverable, they were designed to hit and evade, to strike quickly and retreat before the full weight of a larger vessel's firepower could be brought to bear. Against what was coming, even they were outmatched by an order of magnitude. The 4 destroyer escorts, the Samuel B. Roberts, the Dennis, the John C. Butler, and the Raymond were smaller still, lighter in armament, slower in speed. Destroyer escorts had been designed primarily for convoy protection against submarines and aircraft. They carried fewer torpedoes, lighter guns, and less armor than even the destroyers they resembled. Putting them in a surface engagement against battleships and heavy cruisers was not a scenario their designers had entertained. The men who crewed these ships were, in the main, young Americans, many of them barely out of adolescence, many with no military experience before the war pulled them in. The Navy that fought in 1944 was not the small, professional Navy of the pre-war years. It had expanded at a speed that still seems astonishing in retrospect, absorbing hundreds of thousands of volunteers and draftees and pushing them through training pipelines that were thorough but necessarily compressed. The average sailor aboard Taffy 3 smaller ships had been in the Navy for 2 years or less. Many had never seen a surface engagement. They knew their jobs, their watches, their stations, their damage control assignments, but knowledge acquired in training and knowledge tested under fire are not the same thing. In the coming hours, the distance between those two kinds of knowing would close very fast. What these ships and men had been doing in the days and weeks prior to the 25th of October was, by the standards of what was coming, almost entirely ordinary. They had flown anti-submarine patrols over the waters around the Leyte beachhead. They had provided air cover for the landing operations below. They had rotated aircraft, managed fuel states, coordinated with the larger fleet, and maintained the unglamorous but essential business of sustained operations at sea. The escort carriers had launched and recovered aircraft in cycles that their crews could perform in their sleep. The destroyers had run scream patterns around the carriers, alert for the ever-present submarine threat that stalked American surface groups throughout the Pacific campaign. It was demanding, repetitive, and important work, but it was not combat. Not this kind. The geography of their station placed them roughly 60 to 80 nautical miles off the coast of the island of Samar, the large island forming the eastern wall of the Leyte Gulf approach. The waters there were open and deep, offering nowhere to hide and nothing in the immediate environment shelter behind. If the ocean at Leyte Gulf had a northern gate, Taffy 3 was sitting just inside it, and that gate was now unguarded. The San Bernardino Strait, roughly 50 nautical miles to the north, was the passage through which any Japanese force moving south from the main Philippine island of Luzon would have to transit. Halsey's plan had called for Task Force 34, his powerful surface strike group of battleships and cruisers, to stand guard at that strait. Task Force 34 was not there. It had gone north with everything else, and through the strait, in the hours before dawn, something enormous had passed undetected. Sprague was a man who dealt in facts rather than assumptions. But even he was operating on the same broad assumption that shaped the entire American command that morning, that Kurita's center force had been so badly mauled in the Sibuyan Sea 2 days before that it posed no serious offensive threat. American airstrikes had hit the center force repeatedly. They had sunk the super battleship Musashi, damaged other vessels, and forced what appeared to be a retreat westward. The reporting from those strikes had been optimistic, as combat reporting often is. The damage real as it was, had not broken the force. The retreat had been temporary. During the night, Kurita had turned back east, passed through the San Bernardino Strait in darkness, and brought his fleet, still formidable, still dangerous, still centered around the surviving super battleship Yamato, into the Philippine Sea. He was now moving south toward Leyte Gulf, and the only thing between him and the beachhead was Taffy 3. There is a particular quality to the hours before a catastrophe that those who live through them often describe afterward. The morning had been routine. Breakfast was being served. Flight operations were underway. The radar screens showed nothing alarming. Men who had been on night watch were standing down. Coffee was cooling in mugs in compartments that would, within the hour, be engulfed in smoke and fire. The ships rode the low swells of a calm sea under a sky just bright enough to suggest good flying weather. Clifton Spray was on the bridge of his flagship, the Fanchor Bay, doing the work of a task unit commander on an unremarkable morning, monitoring flight operations, tracking his air groups, watching the sea. He had no reason to believe the day would be anything other than what the day before had been. 13 ships, 13 crews, 6 escort carriers and 7 tin cans, holding a piece of ocean that nobody important seemed to be watching. The storm was already over the horizon. It would take a little longer yet to arrive. The ships that would stand between Imperial Japan's battle fleet and the invasion beaches of Leyte Gulf were never intended for such a purpose. They were, by the standards of naval warfare in 1944, tools of a secondary order, smaller, slower, far more thinly armored than the great capital ships that dominated the headlines and the strategic imagination of fleet commanders. Yet, on the morning of the 25th of October, these vessels and their crews would be called upon to do something that seemed to violate every principle of naval combat, to stand their ground against an enemy that possessed overwhelming firepower, superior speed, and a numerical advantage so extreme that it bordered on the absurd. To understand how this came to pass, one must first understand what these ships were, and who the young men were that served aboard them. Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3 in the radio nomenclature of the American Pacific Fleet, consisted of 6 escort carriers, a type of warship that represented a peculiar compromise between naval tradition and wartime improvisation. These ships, with names like Fanchor Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Caroline Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Gambia Bay, had been converted from merchant hulls, the steel bones that had carried cargo across the peacetime oceans before the war transformed them into instruments of combat. They were small by carrier standards, displacing no more than 7,000 tons, barely a quarter of the weight of a full fleet carrier. Topside, their flight decks were cramped and awkward, requiring pilots to approach landings with extreme precision because any missed approach meant disaster. There was no room for the kind of wave-off and second attempt that larger carriers could afford. Below decks, the compartments were narrow, the ventilation poor, and in the oppressive heat of the South Pacific, the living spaces felt less like military accommodations and more like the hold of a merchant vessel, which in fact they had been only months before. The armament of these escort carriers told the story of their intended role. Each ship carried a single 5-inch gun, a respectable piece of artillery for anti-aircraft work, but useless against the heavily armored hulls of cruisers or battleships. The carrier's real power lay in their aircraft. Each of the 6 ships carried approximately 24 planes, a mixture of Grumman Avengers, stubby torpedo bombers that moved through the air at a leisurely pace compared to faster combat aircraft, and Grumman Wildcats, small fighters with limited range and armament. These aircraft were designed for patrol missions, for hunting submarines lurking beneath the surface, for providing air cover against enemy aircraft, and for spotting gunfire, not for taking on major surface combatants in direct fleet engagement. The escort carriers had been conceived in an era when the dominance of naval aviation was not yet universally accepted, when many in the Navy still believed that battleships would determine the outcome of naval battles. Now, In 1944, these ships would be pressed into a role that their designers had never imagined, with aircraft that were never meant to fight this war. Screening Taffy 3's carriers were 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts, the vessels the sailors called tin cans, a nickname that carried both affection and recognition of their vulnerability. The destroyers, the Hull, the Heermann, and the Johnston, were Fletcher-class destroyers, modern ships by the standards of the early war, but still only 2,100 tons of displacement, carrying 5-inch guns as their main armament, and a battery of torpedo tubes that gave them at least a theoretical strike capability against larger vessels. The destroyer escorts were smaller still, the Samuel B. Roberts, the Dennis, the Butler, and the Raymond, specialized anti-submarine vessels that had been designed to shepherd convoys and hunt U-boats, not to conduct surface engagements against capital ships. These ships carried a 3-inch gun as their primary armament, a weapon that seemed almost quaint when contemplated against the massive turrets of battleships. Yet the crews of these tin cans, the majority of them young men in their early 20s, many of them on their first overseas deployment, carried themselves with the quiet professionalism that comes from knowing a job and doing it well. The men of Taffy 3, scattered across 13 different ships, represented a cross-section of American naval service in 1944. The officers in the combat information centers and fire control stations were often young men from the Naval Academy or from accelerated wartime officer training programs, intelligent, well-trained, but facing the pressure of command at an age when their equivalents in civilian life would still be in college. The enlisted sailors came from every part of the country, from the fishing villages of Maine to the ranches of Montana to the industrial cities of the Midwest, bound together by the uniform they wore and the ship that was their home at sea. Many had never been more than a few hundred miles from their hometowns before the war. Now they were in the tropical Pacific, operating weapon systems that required coordination and discipline, living in spaces so confined that privacy was a forgotten luxury, and the sound of the ocean was always present, whether they were in the engine room or on the flight deck. The camaraderie that developed aboard a warship at sea was forged through shared purpose and shared danger, but on the morning of the 25th of October, danger still seemed like an abstraction, something that happened to other ships in other battles, not to them. The morning itself had begun as mornings typically began aboard ships far from enemy territory, with routine, with the assumption of another day much like the one that had preceded it. Flight operations commenced in the pre-dawn darkness, as they did every day when the task unit was on station. The Avengers and Wildcats were brought up from the hangar deck and spotted on the flight deck, where the pilots and their crews conducted their pre-flight checks, inspecting engine cowlings and armament, testing instruments, and preparing themselves mentally for the flights ahead. The pilots who clambered into the cockpits and gunner stations were young men as well, many of them still in their 20s, some barely old enough to legally purchase a drink in the United States, now entrusted with aircraft that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and with responsibilities that weighed far more heavily than their years. The dawn launch sequences were executed with the practiced efficiency that comes from repetition, the flight deck crews moving with choreographed precision as the first aircraft began to roll down the deck and lift off into the pearl gray light of early morning. Below decks, the crews of the escort carriers were engaged in the endless maintenance and housekeeping that keeps a warship functioning. Engine room personnel tended to the turbines that drove the ships through the water at barely 18 knots, a speed that seemed glacial compared to the 30-plus knots that modern warships could achieve, but which represented the engineering compromise of converting a merchant vessel into a carrier. In the radio compartments, operators sat in front of their banks of equipment, monitoring the net traffic and maintaining contact with the other ships of the task unit, and with higher command. In the damage control parties scattered throughout the ships, petty officers ensured that every hatch and watertight door was where it should be, that fire hoses were properly stowed, that equipment was accounted for. The routine was designed to maintain readiness, but readiness against what? Against a submarine, perhaps. Or against enemy aircraft. Against nothing more threatening than the routine dangers of operating a naval vessel in wartime. In the wardrooms and crew's quarters, men sat down to breakfast, eggs or canned meat, beans, bread, and coffee. The standard naval ration that repeated with monotonous regularity meal after meal. The conversation was probably the sort that dominated every ship's crew. Complaints about the food, dissipation of mail. When they next made port, news from home relayed in letters that had crossed the Pacific, rumors about where they were heading next and how much longer the war might last. Some men probably wrote letters to wives or sweethearts, using the morning hours to catch up on correspondence. Others slept off the night watch, their bodies craving rest in the swaying bunks of the compartments below decks. In the ready rooms where the pilots waited between flights, men studied maps of the Philippine region, played cards, or simply dozed in the tropical heat that seemed to pervade everything despite the best efforts of the ship's ventilation systems. The ordinary rhythms of shipboard life continued undisturbed. The assumption, unspoken but universal, that this would be another day much like the ones that had come before. Aboard the destroyer Johnston, a small, efficient warship that displaced 2,500 tons and carried a crew of 232 officers and men. The morning was noted by the presence of the ship's commanding officer, Commander Ernest Evans, making his rounds on the bridge. Evans was not a typical destroyer commander. He was of Cherokee descent, a member of a Native American nation, and he had risen through the ranks to a command that represented achievement and possibility in the Navy of 1944. He was known for his aggressiveness and his determination, qualities that had made him respected by his crew, who understood that they had been given a captain who would not flinch from danger but who also possessed the tactical acumen to keep his ship and crew as safe as circumstances allowed. Evans had made it clear to his officers and men that the Johnston would never retreat from an enemy, that they would fight when called upon to fight, and that their ship would be remembered. It was the sort of thing commanding officers said, the sort of exhortation that seemed fitting in a military vessel in wartime, but it carried an edge of something deeper, a sense that Evans believed implicitly in what he was saying. Aboard the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, a smaller ship still, with a displacement of 400 tons and a crew that barely exceeded 150 officers and men, the morning watch was being relieved and the crew was settling into the rhythms of daytime operations. The Samuel B. Roberts had joined the Navy less than a year before and was on her first deployment to the Pacific. Most of her crew were young and inexperienced, trained in the specific skills required to keep the little ship operating, but with no combat experience against surface vessels. The ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, was a naval officer of considerable competence and determination, a man who understood the limitations of his command and the vulnerability of the escort destroyer class, but who also believed profoundly in the discipline and the potential of his crew. He walked the passageways and the deck of his ship with a quiet confidence that seemed to communicate itself to his sailors, not the false confidence of ignorance, but the confidence of a professional who knows his job and trusts those under his command. Aboard the Gambier Bay, one of the escort carriers that would later earn the distinction of being the only American carrier sunk by naval gunfire in the entire war, the morning routines continued without awareness of what the day held in store. The ship's company was going about the business of maintaining a warship at sea, of preparing for flight operations, of keeping the machinery and systems running that would be required if the ship came under attack. The crew of the Gambier Bay numbered around 1,000 men, officers, aviators, aviation personnel, engineers, damage control parties, gun crews, and all the other specialists required to operate a carrier. Many of them had been together for months, had gone through the small emergencies that every ship experiences, had developed a loyalty to their ship and to each other. The Gambier Bay, like her sister ships, moved through the Philippine waters at her leisurely 18 knots, her radar continuously scanning the skies and the surface of the sea, her lookouts maintaining constant vigilance, her captain and senior officers monitoring the radio circuits that connected them to Admiral Sprague and the other task unit commanders. In the larger strategic context, Task Unit 77.4.3 occupied a curious position in the American naval structure. The task unit was part of Task Force 77, the 7th Fleet, which operated under the command of Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid. Taffy 3 was the northernmost of three escort carrier task units. Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 were stationed to the south, providing air support and anti-submarine protection for the invasion fleet. The three task units were all part of the overall defensive structure that was supposed to protect the American beachhead at Leyte, but the primary protection was supposed to come from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet to the north, watching the San Bernardino Strait and standing ready to strike any Japanese fleet units that attempted to approach the landing area. This arrangement, seemingly logical in its design, carried within it a critical vulnerability that would not become apparent until it was too late to correct. But on the morning of the 25th of October, the crews of Taffy 3 could not have known this. They could only continue their duties, maintain their ships, prepare their aircraft, and assume that the great strategic machinery of the American Navy was functioning as it was designed to function. The routine would be broken within hours, shattered by a contact that seemed impossible, by the appearance on the horizon of a fleet of ships that should not have been there, by a moment when everything that had been assumed about the safety and the defensibility of the position would be revealed to be catastrophically wrong. But at that moment, in those hours, before the sun reached its zenith, the men of Taffy 3 were simply sailors aboard their ships, going about their duties with the professionalism and the dedication that keeps the machinery of a naval task force operating. The escorts carriers were still jeep carriers, the destroyers were still tin cans, the young men were still young men with their lives ahead of them. Within a few hours, all of that would be tested against an enemy whose power and determination would exceed anything they had been prepared to encounter. But the test, when it came, would reveal something else as well, a capacity for courage, for audacity, and for sacrifice that would earn these ships and their crews a place in the history of the war that would never be forgotten. While Halsey's fleet raced northward through the night, chasing the glow of a carefully constructed illusion, a darkness of a different kind was moving through the narrow waters of the San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Takeo Kurita had been given up for dead once already. American submarines had found his fleet 2 days earlier in the Sibuyan Sea, and bombers from Halsey's carriers had hammered his ships throughout the afternoon that followed, sending the super battleship Musashi to the bottom after absorbing more torpedo and bomb hits than any warship had ever survived, and kept moving. Kurita had briefly turned his force around, and American intelligence analysts watching the retreat had concluded the threat was neutralized. They were wrong. In the hours that followed, under the cover of darkness and the assumption of American watchers that the danger had passed, Kurita reversed course again and aimed his fleet directly at the narrow throat of water separating the Philippine Islands, the strait that Halsey's battle line was supposed to be guarding, and that now stood utterly, catastrophically open. The San Bernardino Strait is not a forgiving passage. Roughly 25 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, it threads between the islands of Samar and Luzon in a corridor of fast-moving currents and poorly charted shoals, a channel that demands careful navigation even in peacetime daylight. Kurita pushed his armada through it in complete darkness, without navigational lights, a speed that left almost no margin for error. Japanese navigation teams worked by dead reckoning and memory, guiding vessels of extraordinary size through water that seemed barely large enough to hold them. There were no American patrol craft waiting in ambush. There were no mines strung across the channel. There was no picket line, no submarine, no destroyer, not so much as a single aircraft overhead to observe what was passing through. The greatest surface fleet Japan had assembled in years moved through the darkness in near-perfect silence and emerged, shortly before midnight, into the Philippine Sea without having fired a single shot or lost a single ship. What came through that strait was not a fleet in a conventional sense. It was something closer to a concentrated expression of industrial and martial will. Steel and fire and intention given the form of washups. At the center of the formation moved Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. A vessel so vast that the figures attached to her strain comprehension even now. She displaced more than 70,000 tons when fully laden. Her main battery consisted of 9 guns firing projectiles of 460 millimeters in diameter, rounds that weighed roughly 400 kilograms each, capable of reaching targets more than 40 kilometers distant. She and her sister ship Musashi had been built as the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power, conceived in an era when the battleship was still considered the decisive instrument of naval warfare. Musashi was already gone. Yamato was here pushing through the darkness toward what her commanders believed would be the final, decisive confrontation. Alongside Yamato moved 3 more battleships, heavy and purposeful in the dark water. Behind and around them came 6 heavy cruisers, their hulls long and gray, their gun turrets trained fore and aft in a careful posture of ships expecting contact. 2 light cruisers completed the main body. Fanning out ahead and along the flanks moved 11 destroyers, their sharp bows cutting the low swell. Their crews at action stations despite the quiet. In total, Kurita commanded more than 30 warships, a force whose combined broadside weight dwarfed anything it was likely to encounter. By any objective measure of naval firepower, it was the most dangerous surface action group operating anywhere in the Pacific that morning. The Americans had nothing comparable in the immediate area. Nobody near enough to stop it even knew it was there. As the formation cleared the strait and turned south along the coast of Samar, Kurita began reorganizing his ships from their transit formation into something closer to a combat disposition. The night was calm. The sea relatively flat, and a light haze hung over the water that would thicken as morning approached. The men aboard his ships had been at sea for days, pushed through submarine ambushes and air attacks that had cost them comrades and ships, and the toll of sustained tension was visible in faces drawn tight with exhaustion. Yet there was also something else, a sense that the thing they had been sent to do was now within reach. The beach at Leyte Gulf lay roughly 100 kilometers to the south. The transports and supply ships that sustained MacArthur's landings were there, largely unguarded. The southern and northern forces that formed the other 2 arms of the Shogo plan were, as far as Kurita knew, closing in from their own directions. All that remained was to push south, break into the Gulf, and do what they had come to do. Aboard the American ships to the south, the night passed in the comfortable rhythms of fleet routine. Taffy 3 Task Unit 7-7.4.3 had spent the previous day flying anti-submarine patrols, conducting routine flight operations, and managing the small, careful logistics of a group of ships whose function was support rather than combat. The escort carriers were not warships in any fighting sense that a naval officer of the previous generation would have recognized. They had been designed and built quickly, converted from commercial hulls. Their flight decks a practical afterthought laid over a merchant vessel's bones. They were slow, capable of barely 18 knots at maximum effort, and their armament was minimal. Their purpose was to carry aircraft and to carry them in the service of ground support, anti-submarine patrol, and logistical cover. On the night of the 24th into the 25th of October, 1944, none of this seemed to matter. It was a quiet night and nobody had any reason to believe the morning would be different. Lookouts maintained their watches in the darkness. Radar operators swept their screens in a methodical pattern that becomes nearly automatic after weeks of uneventful duty. On the escort carriers, pilots who would fly the dawn patrols slept when they could, checked weather reports, and ate early breakfasts in the hours before first light. Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the escort carrier Fanchor Bay, had no indication that the strategic situation had collapsed during the night. The communications picture was fragmented and incomplete, as it almost always was in the complex multi-fleet environment of a major amphibious operation. He knew that Halsey had gone north. He knew that other forces were engaged elsewhere, What he did not know was that the water between his small group of ships and the coast of Samar was no longer empty. The first gray light of dawn touched the Philippine Sea just before 6 in the morning. The carrier formation had launched aircraft for the first patrol of the day. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. The aircraft climbing away into air that was still cool and slightly hazy with the remnants of a night mist. At almost exactly 6:30, one of those aircraft, a routine anti-submarine patrol, flew north of the carrier formation and saw something that did not belong to the world it expected. Below the haze, spread across kilometers of ocean, were ships, warships, large warships, moving south at speed, and some of them, even from altitude, were unmistakably enormous. The pilot transmitted his contact report immediately. Some accounts suggest the aircrew initially disbelieved what they were seeing, that an anti-submarine patrol pilot, looking for submarines, found a battleship fleet instead and took a moment to reckon with the fact before calling it in. On the radar screens aboard Taffy 3 ships, contacts had been building for several minutes before the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. The returns were large and numerous, coming from the north-northwest, a range and bearing that placed them precisely where no American fleet should be and no Japanese fleet was supposed to reach. Radar operators reported to their officers. Officers consulted charts and each other. There was a brief, suspended moment, the kind of moment that exists in every disaster between the point when the information arrives and the point when its full meaning breaks through, and then the meaning broke through entirely. The contacts were real. The shapes resolving out of the haze to the north were real. The towering pagoda-style superstructures of Japanese battleships, distinctive in silhouette even at distance, were lifting above the horizon in the early morning light, and they were moving directly toward the small, slow, lightly armed ships of Taffy 3. The initial radio transmissions from Taffy 3 were marked by a quality that later testimony struggled to accurately describe. Not quite panic, not yet, but something adjacent to disbelief rendered in professional language. Sprague's radio operators were reporting contacts that their training and experience told them could not be there. Japanese heavy surface forces did not materialize off Samar in the morning light. The San Bernardino Strait had a covering force. Halsey was supposed to be there. The reports went out anyway, because the evidence on the screens and through the binoculars was not interested in what was supposed to be true. Colored dye marker shells had not yet begun to fall. The Japanese fleet had not yet opened fire. But Kurita's ships were close, far closer than seemed possible, and they were accelerating. And within minutes the nature of the morning was going to change in ways that nobody aboard those small ships had any framework for understanding. What Kurita did not know, as his formation bore down on the radar contact to the south, was that he had caught something very different from what he expected. Japanese recognition of American ship types was imperfect under the best of circumstances, and what the lookouts aboard Yamato and the heavy cruisers were seeing, small, flat-topped vessels, destroyers of modest size, moving frantically at what appeared to be their maximum speed, was being interpreted through the filter of expectation. They had come here to find fleet carriers and heavy escorts, and if the ships below did not quite match the image in the identification manuals, the mind adjusts the image rather than revise the expectation. Kurita believed, or allowed himself to believe, that what lay ahead of him was worth the full engagement of his fleet. He was right that the stakes were high. He was wrong about almost everything else, and neither he nor Sprague nor anyone else on the water that morning could yet see how the next several hours were going to rewrite the meaning of the word impossible. There are mornings at sea that carry a particular kind of quiet, the sort that settles over a ship like something earned. The men of Taffy 3 had risen before dawn on the 25th of October, 1944, to the routines that defined life aboard an escort carrier group of pre-flight checks, the smell of coffee and aviation fuel, the low rumble of engines turning over in the gray half-light. Flight operations had already begun. Anti-submarine patrol aircraft were being launched into a sky that was just beginning to warm at its edges. The mood across the 6 carriers and their screening ships was the mood of professionals doing ordinary work in an extraordinary place, watchful, yes, but not afraid. There was no reason to be afraid. The battle line of the United States Third Fleet stood between them and any serious Japanese surface threat, or so everyone aboard believed. The world, for one last quiet moment, made sense. They stopped making sense at roughly 6:45 in the morning. A lookout aboard one of the carriers reported what he believed was anti-aircraft fire to the north, distant, unusual, but not immediately alarming. Then a radar operator picked up contacts that refused to resolve themselves into anything the equipment was designed to track at that range. Then, almost simultaneously, the radio crackled with reports from an anti-submarine patrol aircraft already airborne, a pilot staring down in disbelief at something his training had not prepared him to describe calmly. He reported masts, not the masts of destroyers or transports, pagoda masts, the distinctive tall, tiered superstructures of Imperial Japanese Navy capital ships, rising above the northern horizon like cathedral spires emerging from the sea. The pilot's voice betrayed him. He had spotted the leading edge of Admiral Kurita's center force of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, bearing down on Taffy 3 at high speed, separated from the escort carriers by barely 30 kilometers of open water. What had been an anti-submarine patrol had become an eyewitness account of the end of the world. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague was on the flag bridge of his flagship when the reports converged into a single, unbearable conclusion. He was a man who had spent a career developing the calm that command requires, but the accounts of those around him that morning suggest that even he needed a breath before he could speak. He ordered his radar operators to confirm. They confirmed. He ordered his communications officer to get a visual. The visual came back worse than the radar. Bright flashes from the northern horizon, the unmistakable bloom of heavy naval guns firing. And then, before the sound of those guns could carry across the water, the sea around Taffy 3 began to erupt. Great columns of water rose alongside the carriers, tinted in vivid, impossible colors: purple, red, yellow. The Japanese battleships and cruisers were firing die-marked shells, a fire control technique that allowed individual ships to distinguish their own splashes from those of their companions. The effect, seen from the decks of the escort carriers, was something between a nightmare and a hallucination, the ocean blossoming in color around them as shells from guns they could not yet see began to find their range. Sprague did not hesitate. The accounts of his officers and the surviving record of his communications in those first minutes describe a man moving through decisions the way a surgeon moves through a procedure, not fast out of panic, but fast out of clarity. His first action was to get on the radio. He broadcast a distress call in plain, uncoded language, breaking all standard procedure, because the situation was beyond the concealment that codes were designed to provide. He reported his position, the bearing and composition of the Japanese force, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of what was happening. He did not dress it up. Help was needed immediately, from anyone who could provide it. He had no way of knowing that the fleet that was supposed to protect him was more than 300 kilometers away, chasing a decoy. He transmitted anyway, and kept transmitting, understanding that whatever came next would depend entirely on whether someone heard him and could respond in time. His second decision was smoke. Every ship in Taffy 3 was ordered to make smoke immediately. Black, oily funnel smoke generated by injecting fuel into the exhaust, to lay a screen between the Japanese guns and the carriers. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of the screen raced to comply, weaving back and forth across the formation's wake to thicken the cover, their crews working with a focus that left no room for fear. Smoke cannot stop a shell, but it can blind the fire control directors that aim the guns, and in those first minutes, every second of obscured visibility was a second in which the Japanese rangefinders could not lock on to a target. The clouds of black and white smoke billowed outward and upward, merging with the morning haze, and for brief intervals the colored shell splashes ceased to walk closer and began to fall wide again. The smoke bought time, not much time, but some. His third decision was to run for a rain squall visible to the east, a dark curtain of weather hanging over the water that offered natural concealment. The ship's funnels could not manufacture Sprague ordered a course change toward it, pushing his carriers to their absolute maximum speed. That speed was a humiliation. Escort carriers were not warships in any conventional sense. They were converted merchant hulls. Slow and unarmored, their flight decks welded on like afterthoughts. They could make barely 80 knots, barely faster than a brisk jogger relative to the scales involved. The Japanese cruisers bearing down on them could make 35. The geometry of pursuit was merciless, but the squall was there. And it was closer than the Japanese, and Sprague drove his ships toward it with everything the engineering spaces could provide. His fourth decision was the one that would define the battle. He ordered every aircraft launched immediately. Every single one. Armed or not, fueled for long mission or not, carrying the right ordnance for surface attack or not, it did not matter. The flight decks became controlled chaos as pilots were spotted and launched in sequence. Aircraft being pushed to the catapults before their crews had finished their pre-flight checks. Some pilots took off carrying depth charges designed for submarine hunting, weapons almost useless against armored warships. Some carried bombs configured for ground support of the late landings. Some aircraft had already returned from patrol and were being rearmed when the order came. They launched with whatever was on the hardpoints at that moment. A handful launched carrying nothing at all, their pilots understanding that even an unarmed aircraft making an attack run forces a gunner to respond, forces a helmsman to maneuver, consumes the attention of officers who might otherwise be directing fire. The aircraft were not a serious threat to the Japanese fleet. They were sent anyway. They were sent because they were all Taffy 3 had. To understand what those pilots were flying toward requires a moment to consider the scale of what faced them. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built by any nation, was among the ships bearing down on Taffy 3's carriers. Her main battery consisted of 9 guns of 460mm caliber, guns so large that the shells they fired weighed more than a full-grown adult elephant. Each of those shells, in flight, was roughly the size of a small automobile. The Yamato could fire a broadside of those shells across a distance of more than 40 kilometers. She had been designed to be unkillable by anything the American Navy could put in the water against her, and she was accompanied by 3 other battleships nearly as powerful, plus 6 heavy cruisers whose own guns dwarfed anything aboard the escort carriers or their escorts. Taffy 3's largest ships mounted a single 5-inch gun each. That was not a mismatch. It was something closer to a category error, like measuring a mountain and a footstool in the same units and calling it a comparison. And yet the colored shell splashes, for all their terrible beauty, were falling slightly wide. The smoke was working intermittently. The squall was getting closer. The aircraft were getting airborne. In the fog of those first terrible minutes, something improbable was occurring. The most powerful surface combat force in the Pacific was failing to immediately annihilate 6 slow escort carriers that had nowhere to hide. Part of this was smoke. Part of it was the rain squall. Part of it was the turning, zigzagging, desperate maneuvering of ships pushed beyond their design limits by men who refused to accept the verdict that the numbers seemed to be delivering. And part of it, a part that the Japanese commanders would later struggle to explain, was simply that the aggression of Sprague's response was so unexpected, so disproportionate to the resources available, that it introduced a hesitation into Kurita's execution that the Japanese plan had not accounted for. The men below decks aboard those carriers, the men in the engineering spaces feeding fuel to engines that had never been asked for this much, the men in the ammunition handling rooms passing shells upward to the single gun each carrier could fire, the men in the damage control parties who had already begun preparing for wounds they knew were coming. Those men could not see the colored splashes or the pagoda mass or the rain squall. They could only feel the ship beneath them accelerating, hear the thunder of distant gunfire transmitting itself through the hull like a message written in vibration, and understand from the angle of the deck and the pitch of the engines that something had changed in the world above them. They were right. Everything had changed. The quiet morning had become something else entirely, something without a name in the training manuals, something that would have to be named afterward, once the men who survived it found words that were adequate to what they had lived through. Sprague's voice came over the ship's announcing system to his crew, calm in a way that only genuine fear, fully metabolized, can produce calm. He did not lie to them. He told them what was coming, and then he turned back to the business of surviving it. The shells began to fall just before 6:30 in the morning on the 25th of October, 1944. They came from ranges that seemed impossible, vast projectiles screaming across water that only moments before had been routine, almost peaceful. The first salvos from the Japanese cruisers straddled the escort carriers with precision that was almost mathematical in its accuracy. Purple dye markers erupted in towering geysers around the USS Fanchore Bay, then red ones, then yellow. A kaleidoscope of colored spray that announced to every man aboard that they were bracketed and dying. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, standing on the flag bridge of the Fanchore Bay, had only seconds to make decisions that would determine whether any of these ships survived the next few minutes. The shock of that moment, the arrival of what should have been impossible, the sudden knowledge that battleships were firing at his small carriers from beyond the horizon, crystallized instantly into action. Sprague did not freeze. He did not ask for clarification or wait for confirmation. He ordered his task unit to make smoke, to turn toward the rain squalls that lay to the northeast, and to launch every aircraft his carriers possessed, regardless of readiness or armament. Smoke became Taffy 3's first and most essential weapon. The destroyers and destroyer escorts immediately began pouring dense clouds of synthetic smoke into the air, leaving a spreading wall of black and gray that rose behind the fleeing carriers like a curtain drawn across a stage. The carriers themselves added their own smoke, every funnel wide open, boilers driven beyond their designed limits, the small convoy leaving a trail of dark vapor that stretched for miles across the Philippine Sea. The Japanese gunnery officers, accustomed to ranges where their fire control systems could track targets across 30 or 40 kilometers of clear ocean, found themselves suddenly blind. Their shells continued to fall, but increasingly they were firing at smoke, at ghosts, at the last known positions of ships that were no longer where their radars predicted them to be. The smoke screens were imperfect, the wind shifted, the formations drifted, and there were moments when the Japanese gunners found a momentary window through which they could see their targets again. But each time a gap opened, the American ships had moved. Each time a salvo appeared to have found its mark, the carrier it was aimed at had already turned. Its helmsman following shouted orders to put the helm hard over and reverse course. The act of laying smoke was itself a form of combat, a chess game played at full speed with lives depending on whether a particular gust of wind would conceal or reveal. The rain squalls became something between salvation and delusion. They rose from the sea like gray walls, towering thunderheads that offered genuine concealment from Japanese fire control, but only if a ship could reach them and navigate through them without running aground on the underwater rocks and shoals that studded these waters. Sprague knew where the squalls were because he had studied the chart and because his operations officer had been calling out their positions. He sent the escort carriers racing toward them in a desperate gamble that the faster Japanese surface ships, unfamiliar with these waters and without detailed charts of the seabed, would not follow them into that apparent maze of danger. The USS White Plains, the USS St. Lo, the USS Callan Bay, and the others formed a loose convoy, their captains straining to maintain formation while steering toward the weather as shells continued to erupt around them. The squalls offered genuine concealment, but only for brief periods. A ship would plunge into the gray wall of rain and vanish from Japanese sight, only to emerge a few minutes later into clear water where cruisers and battleships would pick it up again. The moments of concealment were measured in minutes, sometimes only seconds, but those minutes allowed the carriers to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers, to change course without the Japanese being able to track the maneuver. It was a game of hide-and-seek played at speeds that would have been suicidal had they not been necessary for survival. Launching aircraft under these conditions was chaos refined into something that functioned. The escort carriers were not designed for rapid launch operations. Their flight decks were short, Their catapults were comparatively crude, and the aircraft they carried were not the fast naval fighters that defended fleet carriers, but rather the slower, stockier planes designed for anti-submarine patrol and close air support of ground troops. The pilots had been eating breakfast when the general quarters alarm sounded. Many had only their flight suits and whatever ordnance happened to be closest to their ready room. Some aircraft were armed with bombs, others with torpedoes intended for submarines, still others with only machine gun ammunition. Some aircraft were not armed with anything at all. The launch operations unfolded in a blur of orders shouted over the general quarters circuit, mechanics frantically running to arm planes that had not been configured for combat, pilots sprinting across flight decks that heaved and pitched as their ships maneuvered at full speed. The escort carriers turned into the wind for only seconds at a time, barely long enough to launch a pair of aircraft before turning back to flee toward the next rain squall. Men were stationed on the flight decks, throwing ordnance overboard that was not immediately needed, jettisoning anything that added weight or reduced maneuverability. The catapult crews worked without hesitation, launching aircraft that were not fully ready, whose pilots did not know what ordnance they were carrying, who would have to figure out their tactics in the air while simultaneously trying to locate the Japanese fleet and understand the size and composition of what they were flying toward. The pilots who launched from those escort carriers that morning were, almost universally, junior officers in their early 20s with little experience in fleet combat. They flew up through the rain and smoke into clear air where they could finally see the battle unfolding beneath them. What they saw was overwhelming: the massive gray hulls of the Japanese warships, the enormous superstructures of the Yamato and the Congo, the spread formations of cruisers and destroyers, all moving methodically through the Philippine Sea in pursuit of the American carriers. The pilots had no time for fear. They had time only for the calculations required to position themselves for attacks, to understand their ordnance loads, to form some semblance of coordination with the other aircraft in the air. Some pilots found their aircraft carrying bombs that would be useless against armored battleships. They attacked anyway, diving at cruisers and destroyers, releasing their ordnance on targets that were barely affected by the explosions but that were forced to take evasive action nonetheless. Other pilots found their ordnance racks empty. They made dry runs instead, diving at Japanese gunners to force them to take evasive action, to waste the few precious moments that might allow another American ship to escape, or for a Taffy 3 small task unit to steal a few more kilometers of distance from their pursuers. The coordination between the air and surface components of Taffy 3's defense was more improvised than planned, but it was effective. As the escort carriers maneuvered in the smoke and the rain, the aircraft orbiting above them would report the positions and movements of Japanese ships to the carriers below. Pilots would call out warnings of approaching cruisers, spot movements in the enemy formation, and track the ranges at which the Japanese guns were firing. The information relayed to the task unit commanders influenced decisions about when to turn, when to accelerate toward the next squall, when to launch additional aircraft. The air component and the surface component of Taffy 3 were operating as a unified system, with the pilots serving as the eyes of their ships and the ships providing the launching platform from which the air attacks could be sustained. It was a level of coordination that could only emerge from units that had worked together extensively, that had trained together, and whose commanders understood how to integrate air and surface operations even under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. The escort carriers themselves demonstrated an almost improbable ability to avoid destruction despite the overwhelming volume of fire being directed at them. The USS Fancher Bay took a direct hit early in the engagement, a shell that penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay. The ship shuddered with the impact, but her damage control parties moved immediately to contain the damage, to fight the fires that erupted, and to keep her functioning as a platform for aircraft operations. The USS Callan Bay was bracketed repeatedly, shells erupting in the water around her with geysers that rose higher than her masts, rain from the impacts falling on her superstructure like a second ocean. Yet she remained untagged, slipping through intervals in the Japanese salvos with a kind of miraculous luck combined with the superior seamanship of her captain and helmsman. The USS White Plains, the smallest escort carrier in the task unit, somehow managed to remain unscathed through the first critical minutes despite being directly in the line of fire. The ships moved not in straight lines but in complex zigzag patterns, their helmsmen following orders transmitted from the flag bridge, each turn designed to throw off the calculations of Japanese fire control officers who were trying to predict where the targets would be when their shells arrived. It was a game of anticipation and counter-anticipation, played across a distance of tens of thousands of meters, with lives depending on whether a captain's instinct about the next move would be correct. The speed of these carriers became both their greatest limitation and their best defense. The escort carriers could make barely 18 knots even when driven to their absolute maximum, which meant they could never outrun the Japanese cruisers and destroyers that were pursuing them, many of which could exceed 30 knots. But they did not need to outrun them. They needed only to evade them long enough for the air campaign to take effect, for the destroyers and destroyer escorts to mount their counterattacks, and for the combination of smoke, rain squalls, and improvised tactics to accumulate enough damage and chaos in the Japanese formation to slow it down. The slow speed of the carriers forced Sprague and his commanders to think creatively about defense. They could not rely on speed alone, so they relied instead on maneuverability, on the ability to turn sharply and change course unpredictably. They relied on smoke and weather. They relied on their aircraft. They relied on the willingness of their destroyers to charge directly at battleships. And they relied on a determination that, having been given an impossible situation, they would not give in to despair. The communications that poured out of the Fanshawe Bay during these opening minutes were desperate and clear. Sprague's distress calls, transmitted in the clear rather than encoded because there was no time for encoding, reached up the chain of command to Admiral Kincaid and beyond him to Admiral Nimitz in his headquarters far away in Hawaii. The messages were stark: American escort carriers under attack by battleships and cruisers. Enemy surface ships have penetrated San Bernardino Strait. Situation critical. The broadcast had the effect of alerting the entire American naval command structure that something unexpected was happening off Samar, that the plan to block Kurita's center force had somehow failed, and that her small American task unit was fighting for its life against impossible odds. The messages also had a secondary effect, and they created a record. They documented the moment when it became clear to American commanders that Halsey had made an error, but the San Bernardino Strait had not been blocked, that there was no heavy battleship covering force between Kurita and the Leyte Gulf. The messages were also, in a sense, a death knell for the formal chain of command that had been established for Operation King II. Kincaid, Halsey, and Nimitz were no longer operating as a unified command structure. They were three separate commanders dealing with the same crisis from different perspectives and different levels of information. The rain and the smoke created a strange kind of darkness at midday. The Battle of Samar was being fought in what almost amounted to twilight conditions, with the sun overhead but the visibility so reduced by smoke and rain and the enormous explosions of Japanese shells that it seemed more like dawn or dusk than the middle of a tropical day. The crews of the American ships could see only the nearest Japanese vessels, typically at ranges of 10 to 15 kilometers when they emerged from the smoke, and sometimes much closer. The psychological effect of fighting under these conditions was profound. The men aboard the American ships could not see the entire battle. They could not understand the full scope of what was happening. They knew only what they could observe from their own vantage point: the splash of shells, the roar of their own guns, the messages coming over the general quarters circuit, the knowledge that somewhere in the smoke and rain there were Japanese battleships trying to kill them. That absence of complete information combined with the reality that they were slowly being pushed back toward Leyte Gulf and the beachhead, created a siege atmosphere, a feeling that they were trapped, that options were closing off, and that any mistake would be catastrophic. The decisions made in these first minutes by Sprague and his subordinates displayed a kind of clarity that emerged from understanding that there was no good option, only better and worse ones. Sprague could have ordered his ships to scatter, to attempt to flee individually toward friendly waters to the south. That might have preserved some ships, but it would have surrendered the concentrated air defense that his carriers provided. It would have meant abandoning the support vessels that were slower than even the escort carriers, and it would have left the transport fleet at Leyte Gulf without any air cover whatsoever. Alternatively, Sprague could have attempted to fight a more formal engagement with his destroyers and destroyer escorts, using them in a coordinated fashion against the Japanese fleet while the carriers attempted to escape. That would have meant deliberately sacrificing the small combat ships to buy time, which he did order, but without expecting them to actually succeed in stopping the Japanese advance, only in slowing it. The path that Sprague chose combined elements of all of these options hold together: make smoke, use aircraft, counterattack with destroyers, protect the transports at all costs, and if it comes to it, sacrifice whatever ships were necessary to accomplish the mission. It was a strategy born not from optimism but from clarity about what mattered and what did not. The men serving in Taffy 3 during these opening minutes of the battle moved through a terrible clarity that came from understanding they were being tested, and that the outcome would likely depend on whether they could sustain their courage and their discipline long enough for help to arrive, or for the Japanese to withdraw. The gunners of the small 5-inch guns on the escort carriers understood they were firing at armored battleships that would shrug off their shells like a fortress shrugging off rifle bullets. They fired anyway, because the only alternative was to sit passively and watch their ships be destroyed without fighting back. The pilots in the air, improvising attack runs against enemies they were not trained to fight, pressed forward because turning back without attempting an attack was not an option. The helmsmen and engineering officers, working in the heat and noise and vibration of engine rooms that were being driven beyond their rated capacity, maintained steam and prop. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague had perhaps 5 minutes to make the decision that would define the battle. His escort carriers were turning now, their sluggish propellers churning the water, but they were not moving fast enough. The Japanese battleships and cruisers were closing at a relentless pace, their shells finding the water round the American formation in geysers of colored dye that marked the ranges like a grotesque surveyor's grid. The smoke screens were buying time, but smoke screens alone would not stop armor-piercing shells fired from distances where the escort carriers could not even see the guns that fired them. Sprague understood with crystalline clarity that his slow, fragile ships would be caught and sunk one by one if his formation continued to run. The math was inexorable. The Japanese would eventually cut off his retreat, bracket his ships in the open water, and annihilate them at leisure. There was only one tactical option available to him in that moment, and it was an option so audacious that most commanders would have hesitated. Sprague ordered his 3 destroyers, the Hull, the Heermann, and the Johnston, to attack, not to make a fighting withdrawal, and not to lay smoke and delay, but to charge directly at the Japanese battle line and press home a torpedo attack against the most powerful surface fleet assembled in the Pacific War. The 3 destroyers received the order at 07:15 hours, just minutes into what had already been the most violent encounter of their careers. These were Fletcher-class destroyers, built during the previous year, carrying a main armament of 5 5-inch guns and a complement of 10 torpedo tubes. They displaced roughly 2,000 tons each. The Japanese ships they had been ordered to attack included battleships that displaced more than 60,000 tons, with main battery guns that fired shells each weighing more than a ton. From a purely naval perspective, what Sprague had just ordered was a direct violation of every conventional principle of maritime warfare. Destroyers attacking battleships in daylight were supposed to do so under cover of darkness, or in conditions of overwhelming numerical superiority, or when the battleships were already damaged and slowed by air attack. The Johnston, the Hull, and the Heermann were conducting their attack in broad daylight, in clear visibility, against a Japanese fleet that outnumbered them by a factor of more than 30 to 1, and against battleships that had not been touched by air attack and were operating at full combat efficiency. What Sprague was ordering them to do was not a tactical maneuver, it was sacrifice, and the 3 destroyer skippers understood it immediately. The commander of the Johnston was Ernest Evans, a 34-year-old officer with a reputation for aggressive seamanship and a personal code that had been forged in the rough years of the Pacific War. Evans was a Cherokee, a member of the tribe that had provided so many soldiers and sailors to the American armed forces. He had taken command of the Johnston only a few months earlier, and he had spent that time welding his crew into a cohesive unit and establishing a command climate that valued both professionalism and loyalty. Before the battle, during one of the regular briefings he conducted with his officers and senior enlisted men, Evans had told them something that would echo to the action that was about to unfold. He had looked his crew in the eye and told them they would never retreat from an enemy. They would fight forward and upward. There would be no backing away. It was a commitment made in the ordinary piece of peacetime training, but on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, it was about to be tested in a way that Evans and his crew could scarcely have imagined. When the order came down from Sprague to attack the Japanese battle line, Evans did not hesitate. He rang up flank speed on the Johnston's engines, and the little destroyer surged forward, her wake churning white in the gray-green water. The 3 American destroyers did not attack in formation. Instead, they moved at intervals, approaching the Japanese fleet from different angles in an attempt to complicate the enemy's fire control and force them to distribute their defensive fire across multiple targets. The Hull moved first, commanded by Commander Frank Hathaway, turning sharply to port and building up to her maximum speed of 35 knots as she drove toward the Japanese cruisers on the left flank of Kurita's formation. The Japanese gunners reacted immediately. Heavy cruiser fire began to fall around the Hull within moments of her turn, and the little destroyer found herself in the center of a firestorm that made the earlier bracket fire seem almost gentle by comparison. Shells bracketed her, straddled her, and eventually found her. The Hull's superstructure was ripped apart by direct hits. Her communication systems were destroyed, her radar shattered, her guns damaged. But the Hull kept moving forward. The second destroyer, the Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, followed her flagship in a wide arc that brought her toward the Japanese formation from a different angle. The Heermann was even smaller than her sister ships, but her captain drove her at full speed directly at the Japanese cruiser line. Like the Hull before her, the Heermann drew a storm of fire. Shells splashed around her, near misses that threw up columns of water that threatened to engulf her. But the little destroyer pressed on, her torpedo tubes trained on the enemy cruisers ahead. The Johnston moved last and most deliberately. Evans had watched the destruction being visited on the Hull and the Heermann, but he had also watched the Japanese response, and he had calculated his approach with what appeared to be almost cold precision. He was not simply driving forward in a blind charge. Instead, he was studying the pattern of the Japanese formation, looking for the gaps where the enemy guns would have the most difficulty creating overlapping fields of fire. When Evans finally turned the Johnston and rang up flank speed, he was not heading directly at the battleships themselves, but instead at the cruisers and destroyers on the Japanese right flank, the formation's leftmost element. The Johnston accelerated, and the black smoke poured from her stacks as her boilers began to approach their maximum pressure. The little destroyer was not fast, but she was gathering all the speed she possessed. Around the Johnston, the water erupted in cascades of shell splash. The Japanese were firing multiple salvos at her, and their fire was coordinated and professional. Shells that weighed nearly a ton screamed through the air and struck the water around the Johnston with tremendous force, sending up spray that drenched her decks and momentarily obscured the vision of her gun crews. But the impacts also had the effect of partially obscuring the Johnston herself in the spray and smoke of the near misses, and Evans was relying on that obscuration to drive his ship forward. As the Johnston closed the range with the Japanese formation, something remarkable occurred. The Japanese gunners, who had been trained to fight their enormous battleships against other battleships or heavy cruisers, found themselves facing a small, fast-moving target that was maneuvering radically and presenting a target that was difficult to track in the smoke and spray of their own salvos. Evans was not moving in straight lines. Instead, he was throwing the Johnston into a series of sharp turns and radical course changes, forcing the Japanese fire control systems to recalculate their firing solutions constantly. The little destroyer was taking hits. Splinters were tearing through her superstructure, but she was still moving, still fighting, still driving forward. The distance closed to less than 10,000 yards, then 8,000, then 5,000. At that point, Evans gave the order to launch torpedoes. The Johnston's tubes had been trained on a target that the crew identified as a Japanese heavy cruiser, one of the enemy ships that was moving on a course that would eventually bring her between the Johnston and the fleeing American escort carriers. The torpedoes streaked away from the Johnston's hull, white wakes pointing toward the target like arrows. At least one of the Johnston's torpedoes found a mark. The Japanese cruiser that Evans had targeted took a tremendous blow beneath her hull, the explosion tearing open her side and breaking her back. The cruiser slowed, listed, and began to fall out of formation, her ability to continue the pursuit compromised by the damage the Johnston had inflicted. For a moment, it seemed as though Evans and the Johnston had achieved the impossible. They had driven directly at a force dozens of times their size, launched an attack that had damaged an enemy warship, and lived to tell about it. But the moment lasted only seconds. The Japanese formation reacted to the attack with a rage that approached the murderous. Every gun that could be brought to bear on the Johnston was trained on her simultaneously. The cruiser that Evans had damaged was still dangerous despite her wounds, and her sister ships moved quickly to revenge her. The barrage that descended on the Johnston was unlike anything she had experienced thus far in the battle. It was not the disciplined bracketing fire of the opening engagement. It was a storm of shells from multiple directions, coming so fast and striking so relentlessly that the crew of the Johnston realized in that instant that they were not going to escape. The damage to the Johnston mounted with terrifying speed. A shell struck her hull near the after-engine room and tore open a hole that began to flood her compartments with seawater. Another shell struck her superstructure and killed everyone in her after-gun mount. The men who had been preparing ammunition, training the guns on targets, communicating with the bridge, all died in an instant of flame and metal. More shells followed, and more. The Johnston's hull was being riddled with impacts. Her decks were chaos of fires and wreckage and wounded men calling for help, but Evans refused to turn away from the fight. The Johnston continued to maneuver, continued to fire her guns, continued to move toward the Japanese formation rather than away from it. There was a quality of almost suicidal defiance in the way Evans was handling his ship. He seemed to be willing to drive the Johnston directly into the heart of the Japanese fleet, to exchange her existence for as much damage as the little destroyer could inflict on her enemies. The crew of the Johnston, watching their ship being systematically torn apart around them, responded to that defiance with their own. The gun crews kept firing even as their positions were being demolished. The damaged control parties fought to save compartments that were already beyond saving. The men in the engine rooms continued to ring the bells and answer the telegraphs from the bridge, kept the Johnston moving, kept her fighting, even as the water rose around them. The Johnston was being overwhelmed by fire and weight of numbers. There could be no other outcome to an attack conducted by a 2,000-ton destroyer against a battle fleet that included the Yamato. Evans knew it, and his crew knew it. And yet they pressed the attack with a determination that transcended tactical calculation. The Johnston was no longer fighting to achieve a specific objective. She was fighting for the sake of fighting for the sake of the honor that Evans had promised his crew they would never surrender. The little destroyer had taken dozens of hits from shells that ranged up to 8 inches in diameter. Her superstructure was destroyed. Her engine rooms were flooding. Her power was failing. But still she fought. Still she fired. Still she moved forward against the enemy. Even as the distance closed and the Japanese guns could see the faces of the American sailors on her decks. At one point, the Johnston closed to such a proximity with a Japanese cruiser that men on the cruiser's deck could see the men on the Johnston's superstructure, could see them working at their guns, could see them dying. For a few seconds, the two ships were close enough that personal weapons could have been exchanged. And the distance opened again, and the Johnston continued her attack, even though the attack had by then become a fight simply to stay afloat and to die with the honor that Evans had promised his crew they would never surrender. The three destroyers had been attacking the Japanese formation for less than 30 minutes when the decision was made to withdraw them. 3 destroyers could not sink battleships, and the damage they were taking was proving unsustainable. The hull had already been damaged so severely that she was beginning to sink. The Johnston was barely staying afloat. Only the human somehow had managed to survive the encounter with relatively moderate damage, though she too was burning and leaking and had taken enough hits to put ordinary ships at the bottom of the sea. Sprague recalled them, and the 3 destroyers began to turn away from the Japanese formation, attempting to rejoin the fleeing escort carriers and get back under the cover of the smoke screens that the other ships were still laying. But the decision to withdraw did not mean the end of the fight for the Johnston or the hull. Both ships were so badly damaged that they could barely move. The hull, in particular, was sinking so rapidly that it was clear to her captain that she would not remain afloat for long. The Johnston was still moving, still fighting, her engine rooms still answering the telegraphs from the bridge even as the water continued to rise around the men working in those spaces. The 3 destroyers had charged the Japanese battle line, had launched their attacks, had inflicted damage, and now they were paying the price for that audacity. But they had done what Sprague had asked them to do. They had bought time. They had disrupted the Japanese formation. They had forced the enemy to divert firepower from the fleeing escort carriers, and in doing so they had changed the course of the battle. The shells from the Japanese battle line were still falling around Taffy 3 when Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague made the decision that would define the battle. He had ordered his 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Hull, and the Heermann, to charge directly at the approaching Japanese fleet and launch torpedo attacks. It was a tactic from an earlier age of naval warfare, one that conventional wisdom suggested would result in nothing more than the swift annihilation of the attacking force. Yet in that moment, with his escort carriers bracketed by fire and nowhere to run, Sprague understood that aggressive action was his only card to play. The destroyers would attack. They would buy time with their own hulls and their crews' lives, and perhaps in the chaos that followed, something miraculous might occur. The USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer under the command of Commander Ernest Evans, was among the first to turn toward the enemy. Evans was a remarkable man, a Cherokee officer who had risen through the ranks despite the prejudices of the era, and whose personal code of honor was as absolute as the steel hull of his ship. Before the attack began, Evans had gathered his crew and made them a promise they would never retreat before an enemy. That promise would cost him and his men dearly. The Johnston accelerated toward the Japanese formation, her engines straining to push the destroyer's relatively modest frame toward battle stations. Behind her, the Hull and the Heermann followed, 3 small ships racing toward an enemy that outnumbered them by a factor of magnitude so vast that the mathematics of it seemed almost unreal. As the Johnston closed the distance, the full weight of Japanese firepower turned upon her. Her gun crews worked with desperate urgency, returning fire against the heavy cruisers and battleships that surrounded her with shells the size of small automobiles. The destroyer's 5-inch guns seemed almost quaint in comparison, pop-guns firing at her fortress. Yet the Johnston's crew did not falter. They drove forward, closer and closer to the enemy formation, navigating through cascades of incoming fire that churned the sea around them into a frothing chaos of white water and black smoke. Commander Evans stood on the bridge and watched his ship absorb punishment that should have sunk her instantly. Shells punched through her hull. Fires erupted, and still she pressed on, closing to a range where her torpedo tubes could be brought to bear. The other destroyers pushed forward as well. The whole, commanding the destroyer squadron, raced ahead to draw enemy fire and create opportunities for the smaller ships to attack. Her guns blazed continuously, pouring out shells at a rate that would exhaust her ammunition supply within minutes if the action continued. The crew of the hull knew they were fighting odds that rendered their survival almost statistically impossible, yet they fought anyway. The ship shuddered with each direct hit. Steel fragmented and flew through passageways like shrapnel, killing men in engine rooms who had never seen the enemy they were dying for. The hull's captain pressed her even closer to the Japanese formation, searching for the angle that would let him launch his torpedoes before his ship was simply overwhelmed. The Heermann, smallest of the three destroyers, maneuvered through the chaos with a kind of desperate agility. Her captain pushed her to her maximum speed, weaving between Japanese shells and smoke, trying to find an opening for an attack run. The Heermann's crew could see the Japanese sailors on the decks of the enemy cruisers. The war had suddenly become intimate in a way it never had been before, no longer an abstraction of naval forces and tactical maneuvers, but men in steel boxes trying to kill other men in steel boxes from distances measured in thousands of yards. The Heermann's guns continued to fire, her shells striking without effect on the heavily armored hulls of Japanese cruisers, but she was buying time. Every second the Japanese spent firing at the destroyers was a second they were not sinking the escort carriers behind them. The Johnston's moment came as she closed within torpedo launch range of a Japanese heavy cruiser. The destroyer's starboard tubes belched out their load, 5 weapons accelerating through the water toward the enemy vessel. The crew watched as 2 of the torpedoes struck home, explosions erupting on the cruiser's hull, sending cascades of fire and debris high into the air. It was a triumph, however brief, in a fight where triumph seemed impossible. But the cost was becoming appallingly clear. The Johnston had taken countless hits. Her superstructure was shattered. Fires raged throughout her length. Her engine rooms were partially flooded, and the Japanese were not done with her. They turned more guns toward the wounded destroyer, determined to finish her. The whole fought with equal ferocity, pressing her attack even as her ship was systematically destroyed around her crew. Her gun crews remained at their stations despite the carnage, loading and firing with mechanical precision even as their shipmates died beside them. The hull launched her own torpedoes, watching as they raced toward their targets, and several found their marks, adding to the chaos in Kurita's formation. But the destroyer was dying. She had taken hit after hit, and her crew was paying the price in blood and broken bodies. The hull's commanding officer ordered her to continue fighting as long as she could stay afloat, knowing that every moment the Japanese were focused on his ship was a moment they were not destroying the carriers. The destroyer would fight until she simply could not fight anymore. Beyond the 3 destroyers came the destroyer escorts, smaller, slower, and even more lightly armed. These were the true tin cans of Taffy 3's defensive force, converted from designs that had never been intended for surface combat. The Samuel B. Roberts, the Dennis, the Butler, and the Raymond had been designed as submarine hunters, not battleship fighters. Yet orders were orders, as Sprague called for the destroyer escorts to engage the enemy. These small ships turned into the fire and accelerated toward the Japanese formation. Their captains understood with absolute clarity what they were being ordered to do. They were being sent to fight enemies many times their size, knowing that survival was unlikely. They went anyway. The Samuel B. Roberts was the smallest destroyer escort in the engagement, and she would fight with a ferocity that seemed to transcend her physical limitations. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, had addressed his crew in the moments before the battle began with a speech that acknowledged the terrible odds they faced. He told them that it was unlikely they would survive. He told them that they would probably be killed, and then he told them that they would fight anyway, with every gun, every torpedo, and every ounce of courage they possessed. The crew of the Samuel B. Roberts took that message to heart, as the destroyer escort raced into battle, firing her guns at enemies that seemed impossibly large. Her crew fought as though they were aboard a destroyer of the first rank, not a converted frigate. The Samuel B. Roberts closed to attack range despite fire that should have annihilated her in seconds. Her 5-inch gun crews worked with almost superhuman dedication, loading and firing as fast as the mechanisms would allow. The destroyer escort's machine gunners blazed away at Japanese superstructures, knowing their bullets could not penetrate heavy armor but desperate to distract the enemy gunners from their aim. The Samuel B. Roberts launched her torpedoes and watched as at least one struck home, adding its small contribution to the disruption of the Japanese attack. But the punishment she was absorbing was catastrophic. Shells tore through her hull. Her engines began to fail. Steam and smoke filled her spaces. The water level in her compartments rose inexorably, and still her guns continued to fire. The human remained in the fight long after any rational calculation would have suggested she should be sunk. She took damage that crippled her, yet managed to keep moving, to keep maneuvering, to keep her guns firing. The Japanese seemed almost reluctant to close with her at times, wary of another destroyer that refused to behave as a destroyer should, that continued to attack rather than flee, that launched torpedoes despite obvious hopelessness, that seemed willing to absorb punishment indefinitely. The human's crew knew they were living on borrowed time, that any moment could bring the shell that would send them down into the Philippine Sea. They fought anyway, knowing that every shot they fired, every maneuver they executed, every moment they remained in the battle was a moment of survival for the escort carriers behind them. Around them, the other destroyer escorts played their supporting roles in this extraordinary last stand. The Dennis and the Butler and the Raymond added their fire to the melee. Small ships charging at cruisers and battleships, launching torpedoes that sometimes found their marks, taking damage that should have been fatal, and continuing the fight with the stubborn determination of men who understood they had nothing left to lose. The destroyer escorts crews were predominantly young, many of them on their first combat deployment, yet they fought with a maturity and steadiness that belied their years. They had been trained for this, and though the scale of the battle far exceeded what any training could prepare for, they executed their duties as though they were engaged in a purely routine naval engagement. By the time the destroyer and destroyer escort attacks had run their course, the Japanese formation was in chaos. Ships had been sunk or damaged by American torpedoes and aircraft. Kurita's carefully ordered battle line had been scattered by the aggressive counterattacks of vessels that should never have posed a threat. The price paid by Taffy 3's destroyers and destroyer escorts had been staggering. The hull was dying, taking on water faster than her crew could fight the flooding, her captain still giving orders as his ship descended toward the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The Johnston was crippled and burning, her power failing, her ammunition nearly exhausted, yet her crew still at their stations, still fighting, refusing to surrender until the very last moment. And the Samuel B. Roberts was in her final death throes, so badly damaged that she could barely remain afloat, her crew abandoning ship as she rolled over and began her descent to the darkness below. These men had held the line. They had bought time for the carriers, and in doing so, they had written a chapter in naval warfare that would be remembered as long as ships sailed the seas. The Samuel B. Roberts was never supposed to fight a battle like this. She was a destroyer escort, a ship designed to hunt submarines in the depths and screen convoys from air attack. Her hull was thin, her guns were small. Against the massive cruisers and battleships now bearing down on task unit 77.4.3, she was hopelessly outgunned. And yet, as the morning of the 25th of October wore on, as the impossible silhouettes of Japanese warships filled the horizon and death came screaming across the Philippine Sea, the Samuel B. Roberts would answer the call. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was a man of direct speech and clearer conscience. As the ship's general quarters alarm wailed through her corridors and her crew scrambled to battle stations, Copeland gathered his officers on the bridge. The conversation that followed would become, for many who heard it, the defining moment of their lives. He did not sugarcoat the mathematics. He did not offer false hope. He looked at the men before him and acknowledged a truth that hung in the air like smoke of the Samuel B. Roberts had no realistic chance of surviving the coming fight. Her destroyer friends, the Hull and the Heerman, were larger and faster. They had more guns, heavier armor, better chances. But the Samuel B. Roberts and her three sister destroyer escorts would have to charge into that same maelstrom. Copeland told his officers that he was going to take his ship at the enemy, close to the bone, and press the attack with whatever guns they had. He told them what that likely meant. He asked them to follow him anyway. The word spread through the ship like a cold wind. In the engine rooms, where the heat was already crushing and the air thick with the smell of oil and metal, men heard. In the gun turrets, where young sailors loaded ammunition with practiced efficiency, they understood. In the damage control parties stationed throughout the hull, waiting and watching the instruments that measured their ship's vital signs, the knowledge settled like dread. The crew of the Samuel B. Roberts was predominantly young. Many of the men were 19 or 20 years old, barely old enough to vote, now old enough to die. They came from Iowa and Texas and California, from small towns and big cities, from the kind of ordinary lives that made their situation even more extraordinary. In the next few minutes, they would face the same guns that had killed tens of sailors at Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal, the same firepower that had sent dozens of ships to the bottom of the Pacific. They would face it from a platform that was, in almost every meaningful measure, inferior to the enemy they were being sent to fight. And yet, there was something in the response that rippled through the Samuel B. Roberts that morning, something that transcended the calculation of odds and spoke to something older and stranger in the human spirit. The crew accepted Copeland's implicit acceptance of probable death. They went to their stations. They waited. Admiral Clifton Sprague had ordered the destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 to charge the Japanese battle line. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to buy time with bodies and ships to throw enough confusion and chaos into the Japanese formation that it would slow, hesitate, and perhaps break apart. The larger destroyers, the Hull and the Heerman, had gone in first. Now it was the turn of the Samuel B. Roberts and the other destroyer escorts, the Dennis, the Butler, and the Raymond. These ships were even smaller than their destroyer cousins, built for a different kind of war, now committed to surface action. They were never meant to survive. The Samuel B. Roberts was 414 feet long, displacing 1,617 tons, a fraction of the tonnage of the Japanese cruisers she was about to engage. Her main armament consisted of 3 5-inch guns, mounted in single turrets. The Japanese heavy cruisers she would face carried 12-inch and 8-inch guns, weapons that fired projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds. At close range, a single hit from a Japanese main battery gun could cripple or destroy the destroyer escort. The Samuel B. Roberts had no armor plating to speak of. Her hull was steel, strong enough for the North Atlantic gale or the dive bomb attack, but never designed to withstand repeated hits from capital ship artillery. Copeland ordered flank speed. The Samuel B. Roberts pushed forward at her maximum velocity of nearly 19 knots, leaving a wake of white foam and black smoke. The morning was chaos. The other American ships were making smoke, laying down dense screens of artificial fog that blanketed the water and degraded the enemy fire control systems. The Japanese gunfire never stopped. Shells of impossible size came screaming out of the haze, their trajectories marked by the colored dye from the spotting charges, purple, red, yellow, and green spray erupting from missiles that fell close enough to shower the little destroyer escort with seawater. The noise was deafening, a roar that transcended normal hearing and became something felt in the bones and the chest. The Samuel B. Roberts's guns responded with sharp, Staccato crack small caliber weapons against huge ones. A David armed with a slingshot hurling stones at Goliath. Around her, the other destroyer escorts were in the same maelstrom, and the larger destroyers, the Whole and the Heerman, were taking catastrophic punishment. The Whole was already dying, her superstructure torn to pieces by concentrated shellfire. The Heerman had taken multiple hits but was still fighting, still maneuvering, still trying to close the range for a torpedo attack. The Samuel B. Roberts began to take hits. The first ones were near misses. The explosions of shells that landed close but not directly on the ship, sending up columns of water and spray that soaked the deck and rocked the hull with the force of the pressure wave. Then the direct hits began. A shell struck the Samuel B. Roberts on the starboard side, penetrating into the superstructure and detonating with a flash of violent light. Men screamed. Steel twisted and tore. Fragments of hot metal sprayed across the deck and into the compartments below. The damage control teams began reporting flooding. More shells came. The Japanese gunners had found the range. The barrage was unrelenting, systematic, the work of experienced gun crews who had spent years perfecting their craft. Another hit on the starboard bow, another forward. The superstructure was being demolished, torn away piece by the impact of shells that seemed impossibly large. The crew in the forward gun turrets continued to fight, continued to load and fire their 5-inch guns, though it was clear that they were delivering minimal damage to the enemy. They were doing it anyway. They were doing it because that was their job, and because the alternative was to surrender, and there was no surrender in what Copeland had told them that morning. The Samuel B. Roberts's engine rooms began to flood. The men working below decks received reports that water was coming in. The ship was slowing, losing power, her engines struggling against the inrush of seawater that meant death if not contained. The damage control parties worked frantically to identify the sources of the flooding and counter-flood compartments that could be sealed. It was a battle within a battle. A desperate fight against the ocean itself played out in the darkness of the engine room and the steering compartments. Above, the bombardment continued. A shell struck the steering mechanism, and the Samuel B. Roberts became harder to control, harder to maneuver. Copeland ordered his helmsman to hold the ship as steady as possible, to maintain a course that kept the guns in action. Another hit, this time on the bridge structure, and one of Copeland's officers fell, struck down by fragmentation. The captain himself was hit, wounded by shrapnel that tore across his shoulder and down his arm, but he remained at his post, continued to direct the ship and encourage his crew. The blood ran down his uniform, but he did not leave the bridge. The Samuel B. Roberts was dying. Every sailor aboard her knew it. The flooding was becoming uncontrollable. The power was failing. The ship was slowing, listing to starboard, her guns still firing even as water poured into the widening rents in her hull. The engine room crew made a collective decision that spoke to the strange calculus of warfare and sacrifice. Rather than abandon their posts, rather than climb up the ladders and hatches and seek safety on deck, they remained below. They stayed at their stations to keep the engines running, to keep the power flowing to the guns, to give the topside gunners and damage control parties every possible second to fight. They knew that as the water level rose around them, they were sealing their own fate. They did so anyway. Copeland looked at his ship and understood that she could not survive. The torpedo attack ordered by Admiral Sprague had not been delivered. The destroyer escorts had advanced too far, and the Japanese had given ground before the desperate charge. But still, the Samuel B. Roberts had done what she was ordered to do. She had slowed the enemy. She had drawn fire. She had advanced into the face of impossible odds and fought until it was no longer possible to fight. The order came to abandon ship. The crew scrambled up from the compartments below, from the gun turrets and the engine rooms, from the damage control stations throughout the hull. The Samuel B. Roberts was taking on water fast now, her list increasing, her final moments approaching. The ship's chaplain was on deck, administering comfort to the wounded and dying, offering what solace the moment allowed. The wounded men, those who had been hit by fragmentation, burned by the flash of explosions, or crushed by the collapse of structures, were being helped toward the rail. The dead were left where they lay. There was no time for anything else. The Samuel B. Roberts' stern was beginning to rise as her bow went under the water, claiming her with a final inexorable pressure. The men scrambled down the side of the tilting hull, jumping into the sea, swimming away from the ship as fast as their exhausted bodies could carry them. Some hung onto life rafts that had been thrown over the side. Others clung to pieces of wooden debris, to anything that would float. The Samuel B. Roberts rolled to starboard with a groan of tearing metal, her hull splitting open, the weight of the water inside her finally overwhelming the remaining buoyancy. At 7:51 in the morning, less than an hour after the general alarm had sounded, the Samuel B. Roberts went down. What came next was, in many ways, as terrible as the battle itself. The men who had jumped from the sinking destroyer escort found themselves in the Philippine Sea, with no rescue ships in sight, no guarantee that help would come. The water was warm, which meant dehydration would claim men even as they floated in an ocean of salt water they could not drink. The sun beat down with merciless intensity. Sharks patrolled the depths below, great whites and tiger sharks drawn to the scent of blood in the water, investigating the dying and the dead with the blind hunger of predators. The men clung together in groups, some on life rafts, others in the water holding on to men who were more buoyant, helping them stay afloat even as their own strength drained away. Some men, already dead from their wounds, were nevertheless kept afloat by their shipmates, who did not have the heart or the will to let them go. The group drifted in the darkness and the sun, marking time by the slow progression of the hours and the terrible, growing awareness that rescue might not come. Some men hallucinated, others recited prayers or sang old songs. A few men, driven to the breaking point by thirst and despair and pain, slipped away into the sea. The group that survived did so by holding on to each other, by maintaining the bonds of shipboard comradeship that had carried them through the battle and now carried them through the second ordeal in the aftermath. The rescue of the Samuel B. Roberts survivors did not come quickly. The battle continued to rage around them. The destroyers that might have picked them up were fighting for their own survival. The escort carriers were fleeing, being pursued, defending themselves against air attack and the continuing fire of the Japanese surface forces. It was not until late in the afternoon, after the Japanese center force had begun its withdrawal, after Admiral Kurita had ordered his ships to turn about and break off the action, that rescue ships were able to move through the area where the Samuel B. Roberts' men were floating. When the rescue finally came, when hands reached down from the relays of other ships to pull the survivors up out of the water, there was a profound moment of release. The men who had cheated death twice, first in the battle itself, and then in the long hours of drifting in the sea, found themselves returned to the living world. They were taken aboard other ships where they were treated for wounds, for shock, for salt water poisoning. They were given water to drink, real water, and food, and a place to rest. Many of them wept. Many of them spoke the names of friends who had not come up out of the water, who had slipped away, who would never return to the lives they had left behind on the morning of the 25th of October. The destruction of the Samuel B. Roberts was not unique. The whole one of her destroyer sisters was sent to the bottom in the same battle, overwhelmed by the relentless firepower of the Japanese center force. The Johnston, the destroyer that had charged so heroically into the attack, was also sunk, though not before she had fired her torpedoes and drawn the fire of multiple enemy vessels. The St. Lo, the escort carrier, would fall to a kamikaze attack that same afternoon. But the Samuel B. Roberts remained unique for one reason: she was the only destroyer escort lost in the entire Pacific War. She was the most outmatched ship in Taffy 3's formation, and she had accepted that outmatch with clear eyes and full knowledge of what it meant. Her crew had listened to their captain tell them they would likely die, and they had gone to their stations anyway. When the order to attack came, they had charged into battle against cruisers and battleships, ships that outweighed them by factors of 10 and 20 and 30. They had fired their small guns against impossible odds. They had held their course. They had done their duty. And when the time came to abandon ship, when the water had claimed the Samuel B. Roberts and sent her to the bottom, the survivors had fought again in the water, against the sun and the sharks and their own despair. Until rescue came, the legacy of the Samuel B. Roberts and her crew became, in the years that followed, one of the most powerful testaments to what ordinary men could accomplish when called to extraordinary sacrifice. The ship herself became a symbol not of victory, for she had been defeated, and as the flight decks of Taffy 3's escort carriers were not built for what was being asked of them that morning. These were small ships, converted merchant hulls with wooden flight decks barely long enough to launch a fully loaded aircraft in calm conditions. Their air groups were composed of Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighters, rugged, dependable machines designed for anti-submarine patrol and close air support of ground troops, not for pressing attacks against the most heavily armored warships in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet from the moment Admiral Clifton Spray gave the order to launch everything, the pilots and air crew of Taffy 3 climbed into their cockpits with whatever was loaded, whatever was armed, whatever could fly, and they went in anyway. The launches themselves were nearly catastrophic. The escort carriers were turning hard at flank speed, their bows pitching in the Philippine Sea chop, shells from Kurita's battleships still raising towers of colored water across the formation. Aircraft lifted off from decks that were shuddering from near misses, some pilots barely clearing the bow before the next salvo landed. There was no time for careful ordnance loading, no time for coordinated strike packages. What followed was not a planned air campaign. It was something rawer than that, an act of collective, improvised desperation that would, against every reasonable expectation, begin to work. In the first minutes after launch, many of the Avengers carried ordnance loaded for that morning's scheduled anti-submarine patrol, depth charges, general-purpose bombs fitted for shallow water detonation, rounds optimized for hunting submarines rather than sinking cruisers. Some aircraft carried nothing at all. The flight decks had not had time to rearm between the pre-dawn patrols and the battle that erupted just after sunrise, and the armament crews had been unable to complete the swap to anti-ship weaponry before the order to launch came. So the pilots flew with depth charges. They flew with bombs not designed to penetrate deck armor. They flew with whatever was in the racks, and when that was exhausted, some of them came back, landed on any carrier deck that was still operational, grabbed whatever ordnance could be loaded in the shortest possible time, and went out again. The logistics were chaos. The airspace around Taffy 3 was crowded with aircraft from multiple carriers, with Japanese anti-aircraft fire and with the constant need to avoid the carrier formation itself. And still the pilots kept climbing back into their cockpits. The principle that emerged, born of necessity rather than doctrine, was harassment. If you could not sink a battleship, you could force it to maneuver. If you could not penetrate a heavy cruiser's armor belt with a light bomb, you could still make her captain flinch, still force a course change that threw off her gun solution, still buy the escort carriers behind you another few seconds of survival. A single Avenger pressing an attack run on the bridge of a heavy cruiser forced that cruiser's captain to make a decision, hold course and absorb whatever the aircraft was carrying, or turn away and lose the firing solution he had been building. Japanese captains, watching aircraft diving toward them with no way of knowing whether those aircraft were carrying torpedoes or nothing at all, made the sensible choice and maneuvered. And every turn they made was a turn away from the carriers. Every evasive zigzag added distance. Every moment spent dodging aircraft was a moment in which the slow, fragile escort carriers crept another few hundred meters toward the rain squalls, toward smoke, toward survival. The Wildcats went in strafing. This was honest enough work against a destroyer or a merchant vessel, but against the armored superstructure of a heavy cruiser, the Wildcat's 50-caliber machine gun rounds were essentially cosmetic. They would not penetrate anything vital. They would not start fires in the engineering spaces or rupture the steam lines that drove the turbines. What they could do What they did, repeatedly, was sweep the open bridge positions, force gun crews behind cover, and create enough noise and distraction that fire control solutions fell apart. A Japanese anti-aircraft gunner flinching from strafing fire was a gunner not tracking the escort carrier on the horizon. A fire control officer ducking from a Wildcat's gun run was an officer not adjusting his battery's aim. The arithmetic was brutal and simply you used what you had. What the Wildcat pilots had was speed, nerve, and ammunition, and they spent all three without reservation. Reinforcements began arriving as the battle matured. Aircraft from Taffy 2, the adjacent task unit operating to the south, were already airborne on their own morning operations when the distress calls began coming in. They turned north, toward the sound of the guns, toward the columns of colored shellfire and black smoke that marked where Taffy 3 was fighting for its life. Aircraft from Taffy 1, the southernmost of the three escort carrier groups, followed. By mid-morning, the airspace over Kurita's fleet had become genuinely crowded with American aircraft, arriving in ones and twos and small groups, attacking from multiple directions, forcing the Japanese ships to deal with threats from every quarter simultaneously. This was not the coordinated, multi-axis strike package that a fleet carrier air group might have delivered. It was a sustained, rolling series of individual attacks, a tide of improvised aggression that Kurita's captains could not track or predict and could not fully suppress. The cumulative damage inflicted on the Japanese heavy cruisers was real and it was building. These were not the battleships. The Yamato and her consorts absorbed aircraft attack after aircraft attack and kept coming, their belt armor and compartmentalization laughing off everything the Avengers could deliver. But the cruisers were different, faster, less armored, built for speed and gunpowder rather than pure survivability. They were more vulnerable to the hits that were gradually accumulating on their hulls and superstructures. Torpedoes launched by the destroyers had already torn up Kurita's cruiser column in the earlier phase of the battle, and now the aircraft were adding their weight to the damage ledger. Fires started in unarmored spaces, gun mounts disabled, radar and communications equipment disrupted. No single air attack was decisive. Taken together, they were grinding the cruiser force down. The pilots were operating on adrenaline and improvisation in equal measure. There are accounts from survivors of the battle describing Avenger crews making 4, 5, 6 attack runs over the course of the engagement, landing on whatever carrier deck was available, sometimes on a carrier that was not even their own, shouting for ammunition or ordnance, taking whatever the deck crews could load in the shortest possible time, and climbing back out over the horizon. Between runs, some pilots flew over the Japanese formation at altitude, maintaining radio contact with the ships below, calling back information about the disposition of Kurita's fleet, where the battleships were heading, which cruisers had broken away from the main body, where the columns of smoke suggested hits had been scored. They were acting as spotters as much as attackers, feeding information into a tactical picture that Spray desperately needed. There was a psychological dimension to the air campaign that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Kurita's officers had been at sea for days by this point. They had survived air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea that had cost them the battleship Musashi. They had navigated the San Bernardino Strait in darkness, in full expectation that American surface forces would be waiting for them on the other side. They had emerged into the Philippine Sea and immediately found themselves under attack by ships and aircraft that should not have been there. Now, as they pressed their attack on what they believed to be a fleet carrier group, those carriers were not fleeing in panic. They were launching aircraft continuously. Those aircraft were swarming the fleet from every direction, and the reports coming in from the cruiser captains were growing progressively worse. The battle was not unfolding the way it was supposed to unfold. It would be the cruisers that broke first. Not immediately, not all at once, but as the morning wore on and the attrition of air attacks layered onto torpedo damage layered onto the sheer friction of a confused fleet action in deteriorating conditions, the cruiser formation began to lose cohesion. Ships that had been driving hard toward the fleeing escort carriers slowed, turned away to deal with air attacks, lost their place in the formation. The tight, coordinated pursuit that Kurita had needed to run down the slow American ships was fracturing into a series of individual actions, each captain dealing with his own immediate threats rather than concentrating on the carriers ahead. This was exactly what Sprague's destroyers and aircraft had been buying, not victory in any conventional sense, but time, confusion, and disorder in the ranks of a fleet that needed to remain organized to be effective. By the time aircraft from outside the battle area began arriving in larger numbers, land-based Army Air Forces aircraft operating from Leyte itself, and additional naval aircraft from carriers further south that had been redirected after Kincaid's frantic distress calls, Kurita's formation, had been in action for several hours. The fleet was not destroyed, the battleships were largely intact. But 3 heavy cruisers had been sunk or would be sunk before the day was out. A 4th was heavily damaged and out of the fight, and the tight formation discipline that surface fleet doctrine required had been replaced by something messer and more reactive. Every flight of aircraft that appeared on the horizon forced another decision, another maneuver, another delay. And delay was, at this point in the battle, the thing that Taffy 3 most needed. What the Avenger pilots and Wildcat pilots and the air crews of Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 accomplished that morning was something that had no precise name in the tactical manuals of 1944. It was not a decisive air-sea battle in the manner that Midway had been decisive. It was not the systematic destruction of an enemy fleet. It was the transformation of a rout into a contest, the conversion of what should have been a brief, one-sided slaughter into a prolonged, grinding engagement in which the side with every material advantage found itself unable to deliver the killing blow. They did it with depth charges dropped on armored decks, with strafing runs that scratched paint and forced heads down, with torpedo attacks pressed home by men who knew the odds and attacked anyway. They did it by filling the sky over Kurita's fleet with noise and fire and the constant, exhausting demand for attention. And when they landed back aboard their carriers, those that survived to land, the flight deck crews who met them had already loaded the next aircraft, because there was still a battle to fight and the morning was not yet over. Of all the ships in Clifton Sprague's small and desperate command, none was more exposed, more vulnerable, or more certain to attract the concentrated fire of the pursuing Japanese fleet than the Gambier Bay. She was a Casablanca-class escort carrier, a ship type that had been designed, built, and commissioned not for fleet combat but for the patient, unglamorous work of hunting submarines and shuttling aircraft. Her hull had been laid down as a commercial vessel and converted under wartime urgency into something that wore the name of an aircraft carrier without possessing any of the armored resilience the name implied. She displaced roughly 8 tons in fighting trim, could manage barely 18 knots at full power, and carried a single 5-inch gun at her stern, a weapon adequate for self-defense against a surface submarine, only inadequate against the towering bulk of a heavy cruiser. On the morning of the 25th of October 1944, she was about to learn the difference between those 2 categories of threat in the most irreversible way possible, when the first salvos from Kurita's center force fell among the escort carriers. The commanding officers of every ship in Taffy 3 made the same instinctive calculation. Speed and smoke were their only friends. The carriers turned south and southwest, pushing their engines to the absolute limit of their rated capacity, while destroyers raced to lay curtains of black funnel smoke between the formation and the Japanese guns. For the faster or luckier carriers in the group, the combination of smoke, the rain squall, and the frantic zigzagging bought precious minutes of confused Japanese fire. For the Gambier Bay positioned on the port, the exposed flank of the formation and slightly behind the others, those advantages were thinner. She sat, relative to the closing Japanese cruisers, like the slowest member of a fleeing herd, visible, reachable, and falling incrementally behind. The Japanese cruisers that had worked around the southern edge of the destroyer screen were closing at speeds the Gambier Bay simply could not match. These were not small vessels. Ships of this class carried 8-inch guns and twin turrets, could steam at 30 knots or better, and had been designed specifically to hunt and destroy enemies at sea. When their shells began to fall near the Gambier Bay in earnest, first in straddles, then in hits, the disparity was grotesque. The escort carriers' damage control parties were exceptional men doing impossible work, sealing flooding compartments, fighting fires, keeping pumps running in spaces that were filling with smoke and water. But damage control can only absorb so much. Each hit took something away that could not be given back. A pump here, a boiler feed line there, a section of hull plating that had held the sea at bay and now no longer could. What distinguished the Gambier Bay's ordeal from a swift catastrophe was its terrible duration. She did not explode. She did not capsize in minutes. She absorbed hit after hit, each one reducing her speed by fractions of a knot, each one narrowing the already thin margin between the ship that was fighting and the wreck that was coming. Her crew kept flying aircraft off her deck even as shells landed nearby, pilots launching into a sky already thick with smoke and anti-aircraft fire, some of them knowing that there would be no flight deck to return to. A single 5-inch gun continued to fire at the cruisers closing astern, a gesture that was militarily negligible and humanly magnificent. The men at that gun could see what was coming. They kept firing anyway. The hits that sealed the Gambier Bay's fate were those that found her machinery spaces. A warship moves or she dies, and when the shells tore into her engineering compartments, flooding them, killing the men who worked in them, destroying the boilers and turbines that translated fuel into speed, the equation became inescapable. Her speed fell. The gap between her and the rest of the fleeing formation widened. The Japanese cruisers, sensing the kill with the precision of practiced gunnery officers, began to concentrate their fire. Other carriers in the group were still receiving shells, still zigging and zagging desperately through the smoke. But the Gambier Bay was slowing to a crawl. She was no longer part of the formation. She was behind it, alone, bracketed by falling columns of water and the impacts of direct hits. Her captain understood what was happening and could do nothing to change it. He ordered damage control to continue. He ordered the gun to keep firing. He ordered his crew to remain at their stations. These are the kinds of orders a commanding officer gives when there is nothing left to give. When the battle has already rendered its verdict and all that remains is the manner in which the verdict is accepted. Some ships in history have been saved at this moment by a sudden change of fortune, a lucky hit on a pursuer, an unexpected aircraft attack, a mechanical failure aboard an enemy vessel. The Gambier Bay received no such reprieve. The cruisers held their course and their rate of fire, and the escort carrier continued to slow and settle. By mid-morning, roughly 2 hours after the first Japanese shells had fallen among the formation, the Gambier Bay had lost all propulsive power. She lay dead in the water, listing with Japanese cruisers firing into her at a range that had become almost point-blank by naval standards. At this distance, gunnery becomes less of a science and more of an execution. The shells did not need to be aimed with precision. They simply needed to be fired in the direction of a stationary target that could not move, could not dodge, and could not reply with anything capable of troubling a heavy cruiser. Her crew fought on as she died beneath them, not because it would change the outcome, but because there was nothing else to be. The Gambier Bay, at this final stage of her life, was less a fighting ship than an act of collective human will, kept briefly alive by men who had not yet decided to stop. She sank at approximately 0900 hours, rolling slowly onto her port side and sliding beneath the Philippine Sea with a finality that was, by the accounts of those who watched from the water, almost quiet. No detonation tore her apart. No single catastrophic event marked the moment. She simply went down, taking with her the dead and the machinery and the framing and the flight deck, where aircraft had launched into battle that morning. The whole physical fact of a ship reduced to a spreading, oil slick and floating debris in the heads of men in the water. She became, in that moment, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by naval gunfire in the entire course of the Second World War. The distinction is not one that anyone aboard her had sought. It is simply what history made of her dying. The men who went into the water that morning numbered in the hundreds. Many were wounded, Some had been burned. Others had been in the sea for only seconds when they discovered that their life jackets, already soaked and salt-laden, were barely adequate to keep them afloat. The Philippine Sea in this region was warm, which was a mercy of a limited kind. It would not kill a man with cold, but it offered nothing else in the way of comfort. Sharks were present in these waters, drawn, as they are, by blood and by the disturbance of a sinking vessel. The survivors would not be waiting minutes for rescue. They would be waiting hours. Some would be waiting more than 2 days. The scale of the survivor situation that was developing in the waters off Samar was becoming, even as the battle continued around them, one of the largest in Pacific naval history. Men from the Gambia Bay were joined in the water by survivors from other ships that had been hit or sunk, the destroyers and destroyer escorts that had charged into the Japanese line and been destroyed in their turn. The combined number of men floating in those waters, clinging to life rafts, to debris, to one another, would reach into the many hundreds. They were men who had done everything that could have been asked of them and more. Men who had fought with weapons that had no business engaging the forces they engaged. And they were now adrift in the ocean, watching the battle continue around them, unable to affect it, waiting for rescue that the disorganized aftermath of the largest naval battle in history would delay far longer than it should have. The Gambia Bay's loss was not simply a statistic in a battle report. It was the physical consequence of a decision made far from those waters, the decision that had sent the main covering fleet north in pursuit of a decoy, and left a handful of escort carriers and tin cans to face a surface armada without protection. Every shell that had struck her hull, every flooded compartment, every failing boiler was a direct result of that gap in the command structure. The men who served aboard her had not chosen to fight a battle that the American plan had never anticipated. They had been left to fight it by the accidents of strategy and the ambitions of admirals who were not present to see the consequences. And yet they had fought. They had launched their aircraft. They had fired their single gun. They had slowed down the advance on the beachhead by simply refusing to die quickly. She is remembered now not as a symbol of defeat but as evidence of something harder to quantify than her victory. The Gambia Bay's name appears on memorials, in the records of the Navy, in the testimony of the men who survived the water and came home to speak of what they saw. She fought in a battle she was never meant to fight, against enemies she was never designed to face, and she made them work for every yard they gained on her. In the end she sank, as ships do, not in silence, but in the language of steel and water and fire, and the men she carried went into the sea, and they kept fighting to live, because that is what the men of Taffy 3 did. They kept fighting when the arithmetic said to stop. They kept fighting because the beachhead behind them held the lives of soldiers ashore and the ships ahead of them, impossibly large and impossibly powerful, still had to be slowed. The Gambia Bay slowed them. That is what she gave. That is what she cost. By the time the Japanese center force had been fighting for nearly 2 hours off the coast of Samar, something had gone wrong, not just tactically, but psychologically. Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato and surveyed a battle that should, by every calculation of steel and weight and range, have been over before it began. His fleet had emerged from the San Bernardino Strait in the pre-dawn hours, carrying the most concentrated firepower assembled in the Pacific War. He had 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers under his command. Against him, the Americans had 6 small escort carriers barely capable of making 18 knots, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The math was grotesque in his favor, and yet the sea around him was full of smoke. His formation had dissolved into something closer to a traffic collision than a battle line, and his flagship had been forced to turn away, not once but repeatedly, to avoid the wakes of American torpedoes fired by ships a fraction of her size. The chaos that Taffy 3 had managed to sow in the center forces formation was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. What had begun as an ordered battle line, cruisers in pursuit of the escort carriers on the flanks, destroyers screening, battleships bringing their massive batteries to bear from longer range, had fragmented almost from the first hour of contact. The smoke screens laid by Sprague's destroyers and the carriers themselves had cut visibility to near nothing at critical moments, forcing Japanese gun crews to fire at radar contacts and guessed positions rather than visible targets. Ships that had been assigned clear lanes of pursuit found themselves cutting across one another's paths in the murk. Communications between Kurita's flagships and his individual squadron commanders were, even at the best of times, fitful and unreliable. And these were not the best of times. Orders were delayed, misread, or simply lost in the noise and interference of a fleet straining to maintain cohesion under air attack and torpedo threat simultaneously. The air attacks alone had introduced a dimension into the battle that Kurita had not fully anticipated in the pre-dawn hours when the American carriers had first appeared on his radar screens. His anti-aircraft crews had been firing almost continuously since the engagement began. American aircraft were everywhere, not just from Taffy 3, but from the adjacent carrier groups, Taffy 1 and Taffy 2, whose pilots had scrambled and flown north to join the fight. Some of those aircraft were dropping ordnance. Others were making attack runs with nothing aboard at all, pulling up at the last moment after their bomb bays had already been emptied. But to the Japanese gunners tracking them, every aircraft that came screaming in low over the water looked exactly the same as the ones that carried real weapons. Every approach had to be treated as lethal. The cumulative effect on Japanese gunfire accuracy, on fleet cohesion, and critically on the state of mind of the men directing the battle was considerable. Kurita had already lost cruisers to air attack before reaching Samar. He knew what American carrier aircraft had cost him at the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea 2 days earlier, where concentrated strikes had sunk the Musashi, the most powerful sister ship the Yamato had ever had. The sky above him was not a reassurance. And then there was the misidentification, the error that has occupied naval historians ever since, and that may have altered the course of the battle more than any single torpedo or bomb. Kurita and his staff had misread the ships they were fighting. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, small and unglamorous as they were, appeared in the confusion of smoke and spray and poor visibility as something considerably more dangerous. The pagoda-mast observers on the Japanese battleships reported fleet carriers, the large, armored fleet carriers of the kind that Halsey commanded. The destroyers pressing torpedo attacks at suicidal range were reported as cruisers. The destroyer escorts were called destroyers. Every element of the opposition, viewed through the fog of smoke and stress and the adrenaline of a battle that had not gone as planned, seemed to be a size class larger than it actually was. This was not a trivial error. A force of fleet carriers implied, to any competent naval commander, the near certain presence of a powerful covering surface force somewhere just over the horizon. Battleships and heavy cruisers that had not yet appeared in the fight but that would be bearing down on him. Kurita's window of advantage began to look considerably narrower once that misidentification had taken root. There was also the matter of what Kurita believed was happening to his south. At various points during the engagement, signals had reached his flagship indicating, or seeming to indicate, that the other prongs of the Shogo operation were achieving their objectives. The southern force, under Admiral Nishimura, had entered Surigao Strait in the night hours. What had actually happened there was catastrophe. Nishimura's fleet had been destroyed in a classically executed ambush by American battleships and torpedo boats, an annihilation so complete that almost nothing survived to report it accurately. But those reports had not yet reached Kurita in any clear form. He was operating on incomplete intelligence, stitched together from fragmentary signals and conditions that made reliable communication nearly impossible. The picture he held of the overall battle was, at best, a rough approximation of reality, and at worst, a dangerous fiction. It was against this background, a fragmented formation, the relentless air attacks, the misidentification of his opponents, the noise and confusion of 2 hours of battle, that Kurita made the decision that has haunted the telling of this engagement ever since. At roughly 9 o'clock in the morning, his ships were closer to the Leyte Gulf beachhead than they had been at any point in the operation. The American carriers were running. Several were on fire or damaged. The destroyers that had charged his line were crippled or sinking. The beachhead, with its transports and supply ships, lay less than 50 nautical miles ahead, and Kurita ordered his fleet to cease the pursuit, reform, and head north. He would later explain this decision in terms of reorganizing his scattered forces to attempt a coordinated strike on Leyte Gulf, rather than a piecemeal one, that he feared arriving at the beachhead with his ships strung out, low on ammunition, and exposed to massed air attack. But the explanation has never fully satisfied those who have studied what happened next, because what happened next was that he never went to Leyte Gulf at all. The decision to halt the pursuit stunned the men aboard the American ships who witnessed it. Sailors clinging to wreckage from ships already sunk could see the Japanese fleet slow and begin to circle. Pilots returning from attack runs looked down and saw the battleships and cruisers, which had been driving south toward the fleeing carriers only minutes before, turning, milling, losing their sense of direction and purpose. The enormous Yamato, forced north during the battle to avoid torpedo runs, had fallen so far behind the pursuit that she had effectively been a spectator to the decisive phase of the engagement. Now she was being told to circle and wait while Kurita made up his mind. The indecision transmitted itself through the formation. Ships that had been closing for the kill eased back. Guns that had been firing fell silent. What the historians have argued over in the decades since the guns cooled is whether any single factor explains the reversal, or whether it was the accumulation of everything, the exhaustion, the losses already suffered on the two-day approach to Leyte, the death of officers Kurita had relied on, the shattering of his original battle plan by resistance he had never expected from ships this small. Kurita had been in the water himself when his flagship was sunk beneath him 2 days earlier in the Sabunti. He had been pulled from the sea and transferred to the Yamato already physically depleted, already grieving the loss of men he commanded. The psychological weight of all of this on a commander in the middle of a battle that had spun badly out of his control should not be dismissed when trying to understand why his nerve, if that is what it was, gave way at the moment it did. There is a harder question beneath the historical debate, and it is this: even if Kurita had pressed on, even if he had driven his battered, disorganized fleet the remaining distance to the beachhead, would it have mattered as decisively as the maximal case scenario suggests? The transports he sought were already moving. American air power would have been on him within the hour. His ammunition was depleted. His cruiser screen was reduced. The beachhead was not simply a collection of defenseless hulls waiting to be destroyed. It was covered by shore-based aircraft, by the remaining carrier groups, and by the knowledge that every minute he spent there increased the risk of meeting House's third fleet returning from the north. These are the qualifications that exist, but they should not be used to shrink what Taffy 3 accomplished. Because the more uncomfortable reality is that we will never know with certainty what Kurita would have found at Leyte Gulf. And the men of the escort carriers and the tin cans never had the luxury of calculating the odds before they fought. What is certain is that when Kurita finally turned his fleet away from the Leyte Gulf beachhead and steered back toward the San Bernardino Strait, he left behind, as he churned by the wreckage of the battle his fleet had failed to finish. He left behind men in the water. He left behind the burning hulks of American ships whose crews had charged his battle fleet and refused to look away. And he left behind, unresolved and unfinished, the question of what the largest surface action in the history of naval warfare had actually decided, a question that history answered not in Kurita's favor, but in the favor of the small, slow, wrongly armed ships that had stood in his way and refused to move. The Battle of Samar had already rewritten every assumption about what a small ship could endure, what a crew could ask of itself, and what survival might cost. The destroyers had charged into the guns of battleships. The escort carriers had run for squalls with shells rising in colored towers around their hulls. Men had died on steel decks that were never meant to be brought within range of heavy naval gunfire. And yet, as the morning wore on and Kurita's fleet began to show signs of the confusion that would eventually drive it back through the San Bernardino Strait, a second threat was already forming in the sky above the Philippines, one that the men of Taffy 3 had no framework to understand, no doctrine to answer, and no real defense against. It did not come from the horizon. It came from above. For weeks before the battle, a new program had been quietly taking shape within the Imperial Japanese Navy's Air Command. The idea was not, at its core, complicated. Japan had begun the war with some of the finest naval aviators in the world, aggressive, skilled, deeply trained men who had prosecuted some of the most audacious carrier operations in history. But 4 years of war had burned through those men at a rate the empire could not sustain. By the autumn of 1944, Japan still had aircraft. What it was running desperately short of was the experience and training needed to use those aircraft effectively in conventional combat. A pilot who had accumulated only a fraction of the flight hours of his American counterpart could not win a dogfight or press home a bombing run with any real confidence of hitting his target. But he could. The logic ran guide himself into one. The program was named after the divine wind, the typhoon said to have destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet 7 centuries earlier. It was called the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps. The first organized, coordinated kamikaze attacks in history took place on the morning of the 25th of October 1944, the same morning that Kurita's fleet appeared out of the north and the destroyers of Taffy 3 were making their charge into the Japanese battle line. The timing was not coincidental. The Shogo operation had always envisioned a multi-dimensional assault on the American fleet, and Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of this special attack program, had coordinated the first mass strikes to coincide with the surface action. A formation of aircraft, some of them converted fighter planes stripped of everything except the weight they needed to stay airborne and the bomb they had been fitted to carry to their target, lifted off from Mabalacat airfield on Luzon in the early morning hours. Their mission was simple to describe and almost impossible to stop. The men flying these aircraft were, in many cases, very young. They had been selected, trained, and prepared with a deliberateness that still unsettles those who study the record. They wrote letters to their families. They followed rituals. They understood precisely what was being asked of them. The historical record does not allow a clean or simple reading of their inner lives. It would be a distortion to flatter them into either fanatics or victims, but it is clear that they had arrived at the airfields off Luzon having accepted something that no pilot in any other air force in the world was being asked to accept. Their sacrifice was institutional. It was planned. And on the morning of the 25th of October, it was about to become devastatingly real. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were already fighting for their lives against Kurita's surface ships when the first kamikaze contacts began to register. The combat air patrol over the task unit was thin. Many of the aircraft that might have provided a defensive screen were already committed to attack runs against the Japanese fleet, making improvised strikes with bombs intended for other missions, or flying dry runs to distract Japanese gunnery. The carriers below were slow, their decks cluttered with the chaos of continuous launch operations. Their crews exhausted and already shaken by hours of surface engagement. When the reports came in that unidentified aircraft were inbound, the instinctive assumption was that they were conventional attackers. Planes that could be driven off or shut down, that would break away when damaged, that would flinch when the anti-aircraft fire intensified. That assumption was about to be shattered. The Fanchor Bay was struck first, absorbing a hit that caused serious damage but did not sink her. Other ships in the task unit, and in the adjacent Taffy groups, the carriers and screening vessels of Taffy 1 and Taffy 2, operating to the south, were also attacked as the morning progressed, several of them sustaining damage from aircraft that simply did not pull away. Gunners who had trained their sights on incoming planes and watched their fire connect, watched pieces come off the target, watched smoke trail from the engine, could not understand why the aircraft kept coming. Deflection, shooting, lead angles, fire discipline, none of it mattered in quite the same way against a pilot who was not trying to escape. The mathematics of aerial gunnery had been built on the assumption that the man in the cockpit wanted to survive. That assumption was gone. And then came the scent. Lo, she had been known for most of her short life by a different name, the Midway, but had been redesignated to free that name for a larger fleet carrier being built. She was one of Taffy 3-6 escort carriers, small and slow, converted from a merchant hull, armed with almost nothing, capable of engaging a capital ship and carrying a crew of several hundred men who had expected another quiet day of anti-submarine patrol and aircraft support. She had survived the surface action, emerging from the smoke and the squalls, and the destroyer charges intact, which was itself a near miracle, when a lone Japanese aircraft appeared above her shortly before 11 o'clock in the morning. Her gunners opened up. They scored hits. The aircraft, a Zero, began to smoke. It kept coming. The Zero struck the flight deck of the St. Lo, and its bomb carried through the deck into the ship's interior, detonated in the hangar bay below. What followed was a series of secondary explosions as aircraft fuel, ordnance, and stored munitions cooked off in chain reaction blasts that tore through the ship from the inside. The crew fought the fires, but the damage was catastrophic and accelerating. Within half an hour of the strike, the St. Lo rolled over and sank, the first ship in history to be sunk by an organized kamikaze attack, and the only American escort carrier lost to enemy action during the entire Battle of Samar. In those final catastrophic minutes of surface contact, more than 100 of her crew did not survive. The men who made it into the water joined the growing numbers of Taffy 3 sailors already floating in the Philippine Sea from the other ships that had gone down that morning. What the kamikaze attack on the St. Lo and the other strikes that followed revealed was something that went beyond the tactical damage inflicted on that one terrible morning. It was a signal, unmistakable, deliberate, about the kind of war Japan intended to fight from that point forward. Conventional air power had been steadily eroded, not just in numbers but in the quality of the men available to fly it. The kamikaze was not a replacement for conventional air power. It was an acknowledgement of its absence. It was also, in a cold strategic calculus, a more efficient use of what Japan still possessed, aircraft and fuel and young men willing to serve, than any conventional strike mission that required the pilot to return. Every kamikaze that reached its target had, by definition, completed its mission. That was a logic with no natural ceiling. The psychological weight of that logic settled onto the men of the American fleet with a heaviness that did not lift easily. A wounded kamikaze pilot was still a kamikaze. A burning kamikaze was still a kamikaze. You could destroy the engine, shatter the canopy, blow away the tail surfaces, and if the aircraft was still moving forward with any momentum at all, it was still a threat. The defensive doctrine that American gunners had developed over years of Pacific fighting, track the aircraft, wait for the right firing solution, lead the target, break the pilot's nerve or break his aircraft, had to be rebuilt almost from scratch against an enemy who had removed the breaking of nerve from the equation entirely. Within weeks of the 25th of October, American ships would begin developing new techniques, tighter combat air patrol rotations, longer-range radar picket lines, faster-firing anti-aircraft batteries. None of it would ever make kamikaze attacks reliably stoppable. They would go on to sink dozens of American ships and damage hundreds more before the war ended. For the men aboard the escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3 who witnessed the death of the St. Lo, the sight carried a specific and personal weight. They had already that morning watched ships they knew, ships crewed by men they had eaten with, trained with, communicated with on tactical frequencies, go down in the surface action. They were still absorbing those losses, still trying to understand what had happened to them in the hours before dawn when the sky opened a second front. There was no pause between the end of one crisis and the beginning of another. The sea around them was still littered with debris from the surface engagement when the kamikazes arrived. It was as though the day itself had decided that a single catastrophe was not sufficient. The Battle of Samar had begun as a surface action, a brutal, almost medieval collision of steel and gunfire in which size and weight and armor were supposed to be the deciding factors. It had been transformed, in those morning hours, by the audacity and sacrifice of the tin cans and their crews into something more complicated. Now it was acquiring a third dimension that pointed not backward to the great gun battles of naval history but forward, into a new kind of war that would define the final year of the Pacific Campaign. The kamikaze was Japan's answer to the question of how to keep fighting when conventional fighting no longer worked. It was terrible, and it was rational, and it was going to get worse before it got better. On the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, as the smoke from the St. Lo rose into the Philippine sky and her survivors struck out for whatever wreckage they could reach, the men of Taffy 3 became among the first to understand, with a clarity that no briefing could have provided, exactly what that answer meant. Far to the north, Admiral William Halsey stood on the flag bridge of his battleship and watched the horizon with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was about to win the war in a single afternoon. His Third Fleet was closing on the Japanese carrier force, the decoy that had drawn him away from San Bernardino Strait, and in his mind, the engagement ahead would be historic, conclusive, the kind of hammer blow that ended campaigns. He had no reason to doubt himself. His ships were the most powerful afloat, his pilots were blooded and lethal, and the enemy carriers ahead of him were, by every report he had received, real and dangerous and worth chasing. What he did not know, what no one had yet told him with sufficient clarity and urgency, was that the fleet he had left behind was already burning. The first signals from Admiral Thomas Kinkaid reached Halsey in fragments, imperfect transmissions bouncing across hundreds of kilometers of open Pacific sky. Kinkaid commanded the 7th Fleet, the forces directly supporting MacArthur's landings at Leyte, and his messages in the early morning hours of the 25th of October, 1944, carried a desperation that cut through the usual formality of naval traffic. He reported that his escort carriers were under attack by heavy surface units. He reported battleships. He reported cruisers. He requested immediate assistance from Task Force 34, the powerful surface action group built around Halsey's fast battleships, the force that Kinkaid had understood from an earlier Halsey's signal to be standing guard at the mouth of San Bernardino Strait. The assumption had never been confirmed. The strait had been left wide open, and Kinkaid's requests for help were flying across a communications network already struggling under the weight of an enormous multi-front battle. Halsey received Kinkaid's appeals and for a time kept moving north. His reasoning was not reckless by the logic he was operating under. He genuinely believed his airstrikes had already crippled the center force, that the 7th Fleet's own resources were sufficient, and that the opportunity ahead of him was too valuable to abandon on the basis of incomplete information from a subordinate command. He radioed back that he was engaged and that Kinkaid should look to his own resources. He detached a carrier group and sent it south to provide air support, but he did not turn his battleships around. The distance involved was enormous. More than 300 kilometers separated his battle line from the fight off Samar, and every kilometer north he traveled was another kilometer and another hour away from a battle already raging. The men of Taffy 3 were dying while the mathematics of fleet movement calculated itself into irrelevance. Then came the signal that would define the controversy for decades. It originated at Pearl Harbor from Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of all Pacific naval forces. His communications staff, attempting to clarify the chaos pouring across the fleet frequencies, sent Halsey a message asking for the location and status of Task Force 34. Standard padding was added to the message, as was always done to confuse enemy code breakers, random phrases attached to the beginning and end of the genuine text. The authentic question reads simply, "Where is Task Force 34?" But as decoded and received aboard Halsey's flagship, the full message arrived with additional words that, stripped of their context as padding, read as a pointed rebuke. The decoded signal asked where Task Force 34 was, and the surrounding words gave it the tone of a reprimand, as if the entire Pacific Command was demanding to know what on earth Halsey thought he was doing. He read it as exactly that. He believed, in that moment, that Nimitz himself was questioning his judgment in front of every officer and signalman who shared the frequency. Halsey's reaction was visceral and immediate. By the accounts of those who stood near him on the bridge, the message struck him like a physical blow. His face darkened. His voice, when he spoke, carried a fury that his staff rarely witnessed even in the worst moments of combat. He had been fighting the Japanese across the Pacific for years, had absorbed the anguish of Pearl Harbor, had pushed his forces to the edge of their endurance again and again, and now, at the moment he believed he was closing for the decisive stroke, was being publicly questioned from the highest level of command. The rage was genuine, deep, and personal, and it was also, in the way that strong emotion so often functions under pressure, clarifying. He could not continue north under these circumstances. He gave the order to reverse course. Task Force 34 turned south. Halsey's battleships swung their massive hulls around in the open Pacific and pointed their bows back toward San Bernardino Strait, toward the battle they had never been there to prevent. It was, by most reckonings, already past midday. The Battle of Samar had been raging for hours. The Johnston was already gone, or going. The Samuel B. Roberts was sinking. The Gambia Bay had slipped beneath the surface. Sprague's remaining ships were still fighting, still launching the aircraft, still making smoke, but the crisis had already passed its peak without Halsey. The reversal of course that his fleet was now executing would never close the distance in time. His battleships were racing toward a battle that had already, its most desperate phase, been decided by the men he had not been there to protect. The bitter irony was compounded by what Halsey gave up in turning south. The Japanese carrier force he had been pursuing to the north, the decoy fleet that had drawn him away so successfully, was now within reach of destruction. His airstrikes had already badly damaged it. A few more hours, the continued pressure of his full fleet, and those carriers could have been annihilated completely, removing the last significant Japanese carrier aviation capacity from the war. By turning south, Halsey sacrificed that opportunity. He arrived too late to engage Kurita's center force, which had already withdrawn through San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness, and he arrived too late to finish the decoy carriers he had come so close to destroying. He had, through a sequence of fateful decisions, managed to be fully decisive in neither battle. The sea offered no prize for good intentions. The communications failures that underpinned the entire disaster were, by any measured assessment, systemic and serious. The division of command between Halsey's Third Fleet and Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet created an architecture of ambiguity that no single message, however urgent, could fully bridge. The two fleets technically operated under different chains of authority. Halsey reported to Nimitz, Kinkaid to MacArthur, and the coordination between them relied on assumptions rather than confirmed orders. When Halsey signaled his intention to form Task Force 34, Kinkaid read it as a statement of fact rather than a conditional plan. When Halsey moved north, Kinkaid believed the strait was guarded. Neither man had checked the other's understanding. The gap between what was signaled and what was understood cost the lives of hundreds of sailors and came within a threat of costing the entire Leyte operation. In the weeks and months after the battle, the controversy between the two admirals became one of the most acrimonious in American naval history. Kinkaid was publicly restrained but privately furious. He had asked for help. He had asked clearly and repeatedly. And his escort carriers, his destroyers, his destroyer escorts, his men, had been left to face a battle fleet without the support they had been promised. Halsey, for his part, defended his decisions with the tenacity of a man who had genuinely believed he was making the right call at every turn, who had seen the pursuit of the carrier force as his primary and legitimate mission, and who was not inclined to accept blame for the decisions of others, including those who had written ambiguous orders and those who had failed to close the strait before the battle began. Neither man fully conceded the other's grievances. The disagreement outlasted the war. The investigation that followed examined command, communications, and the fundamental question of who bore responsibility for the near catastrophe.